So scrutiny of EU legislative proposals Schedule B, COM 2019-229. Is it agreed that COM 2019-229 does not warrant further scrutiny? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to have our hearings on the National Broadband Plan, and I'd like to welcome the following officials from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment to the meeting to discuss the National Broadband Plan. We have Mr Mark Griffin, Secretary-General, Mr Ciarán O'Hoban, Assistant Secretary, Mr Fergal Mulligan, Programme Director, National Broadband Plan, Mr Patrick Neary, Chief Technical Officer, Ms Orla Ryan, Principal Officer, National Broadband Plan Division, and Ms Ciara Kennedy, Assistant Principal of the National Broadband Plan Division. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you're directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements that you made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And I just remind members to turn off your mobile phones. So I'll now invite Mr Mark Griffin to give your opening statement.
Thanks very much, Chair. First of all, I want to apologise for the fact I wasn't able to be here on the 22nd of May when the committee last met with the Department on this particular issue. So I'm glad to be back before the committee today and to deal with some of the issues that have arisen in the intervening period and some of the evidence that you've heard from a wide range of experts in the telecommunications, finance and regulatory sector. And obviously we've listened to the inputs, both supportive of the approach taken, but also, as one would expect, contrary views over the last number of weeks. I think it's fair to say, when you look at the range of interventions over the last few weeks, there appears to be broad support for the following policy objectives. High-speed broadband should be provided to 100% of premises in the country. There needs to be strong protections for the state with full transparency of where the state subsidy is being directed. There needs to be equal access for all commercial retail providers to the network so that consumers can get the lowest costs and highest levels of service. We need to provide a future-proof network to ensure that in the future a digital divide between urban and rural areas does not re-emerge. And this is reflected in the approach of a predominantly fibre solution proposed by Government, which is supported by Comreg in their evidence. And that prices should be affordable for users, both for connections and for products. These objectives are set out in the strategy approved by Government in December 2015 and signed up to by bidders through the pre-qualification process. There has been commentary to date about the complexity of the process. It is the scale of the project that brings complexity and not the process itself. This is an ambitious one-off intervention to bring high-speed broadband to 1.1 million people, 540,000 premises across the country, dispersed amongst the most challenging areas in terms of geography and topography. The competitive dialogue process was chosen as it is designed for processes of this type, where it is not possible to fully define tender requirements without extensive engagement with bidders. The Department's negotiating team met with the bidders on over 450 occasions, culminating in over 850 hours of dialogue overall. We left no stone unturned in working with the bidders throughout the process. We have embedded very strict governance into the contract, reflecting requirements of state aid rules, the public spending code, the level of state subsidy involved, and the fact that we are dealing with a 25-year contract. The importance of strong governance to protect the taxpayers' interests was recognised from the outset of the procurement. Following consultation with stakeholders, including Comreg, the detailed principles of the governance model were set out in the procurement documents and also agreed to by the shortlisted bidders. These included access for all bidders to critical infrastructure on equal terms, significant penalties to address underperformance, substantial oversight arrangements to monitor progress, costs and take-up, substantial clawback provisions and cost savings achieved or to share in future excess profits, and a standalone board responsible for the ring-fenced operations and day-to-day management of NBPco, with the board required to report to the Minister regularly. Comments have been made about the capacity of National Broadband Ireland to deliver the National Broadband Plan. NBI has been subject to a rigorous evaluation process both in terms of its financial and technical capabilities and its proposed solution. NBI has participated in the process for more than 3 years and at each point in that process has met the Department's detailed assessment criteria, which have been published and in some key areas well exceeded those requirements. It has the experience and expertise to carry out the work it has been asked to do and deliver a project of the size and complexity of the NBP. Insofar as the Air 300K are concerned, in April 2017 the Department published an updated high-speed broadband map. This took account of commercial operator plans which had not materialised and new developments since the publication of the original map, notably the commitment agreement signed by Air with the Department to deploy high-speed broadband to approximately 300,000 premises in rural Ireland. The Department was obliged to take account of the Air proposals in accordance with state aid rules, and the map and the number of premises in the intervention area was adjusted downwards accordingly. Evidence from ESB at the committee last week indicate that this decision, unavoidable though it was from a state aid perspective, had a material impact on the commercial viability of the project. The Department notes the detailed contribution of Air last week, where they asserted that high-speed broadband could be provided in the intervention area for €1 billion if they were allowed to deliver it outside what they refer to as the constraints of the NBP procurement process. In subsequent correspondence with the Department received last Friday and copied to the committee, they set out a range of €512 million to €1.55 billion of subsidy, with the higher figure referred to as the mid-range scenario and exclusive of VAT and contingency. In its letter, Air make it clear that this is not a formal offer designed to replace or supersede the current NBP procurement process. Nor could it be, as Air withdrew from the process in 2017. From a purely legal perspective, the Government could not accept such an offer even if it were made, given procurement law and state aid law. The State cannot simply mandate and fund directly outside the procurement process any economic undertaking to carry out a project of this nature. We have covered this ground previously when the issue arose about assigning the NBP to ESB. If we had to start a new procurement process for whatever reasons, we estimate it would take at least 3 years, taking account of the requirement to consult on a new strategy, the procurement rules which mandate particular timelines, state aid notification, a new cost-benefit analysis and an evaluation process. Further time will be required to mobilise and commence rollout. In 3 years' time, the preferred bidder under the current process would have connected up to 1,000 broadband connection points across all counties and passed over 200,000 premises with high-quality, high-speed broadband at affordable prices. There would be no guarantee that a new procurement process would attract bidders, and if it did, there could be no certainty as what the ultimate price would be. What is certain, though, is that whatever form that process took, the resulting contract would still need robust governance and oversight measures of the nature specified in the current contract. The Department welcomes the commitment in the Air letter to supporting the NBP and the provision of pole and duct products, and in fact, when we met with Air on the 28th of May, they reaffirmed that to us in a bilateral meeting that we had with them. We received the letter, as I said, on Friday evening last. We've had an opportunity to carry out an assessment of the Air letter, and we are happy to take questions on it from the committee. I might also add that I'm aware that you've received a separate note from Analysis Mason on the Air 300K overbuild during the course of today, and we did submit an aid memoir on the contract provisions, and I have to apologise first of all for the lateness of my own statement being submitted to the committee and also the lateness of those supporting documents, but we can orally present on some of them if that's helpful to the committee during the course of this evening.
Thank you very much. And I might just start with one or two questions. Can you give me your perspective on Air's contribution to our committee here last week, and also what did Air bid while they were in the process?
Okay. So we listened very closely to what the CEO said in her evidence last Tuesday, I think it was, and obviously we received the letter on Friday evening and we've been studying that very closely since, and it's been in the possession of the committee for a number of days. Just to recapping a couple of points I made in my opening statement. The letter that AIR suggests, first of all, it's not a formal proposal. They suggest that they could deliver broadband in the intervention area for between 512 million and 1.55 billion if they were allowed to deliver it outside what they call the constraints of the MBP procurement process. And in the letter they refer to 1.55 billion as their mid-case scenario. So that's kind of equivalent to the mid-case scenario that we set out in the National Broadband Plan documentation which we published, which is about 2.1 billion. I suppose the key points at a high level that I draw from the AIR letter, they've said that they recognise that the MBP is a public policy intervention with societal and political objectives, and this is likely to influence the solution chosen, and it is, and we'll talk a bit more about that during the course of this evening. Again, they state they're not making a formal offer to replace the MBP procurement process, and that remains firmly committed to supporting the NBP and the provision of pole and duct products to NBI, which is really, really important in terms of the rollout of the network in the intervention area. It sets out in what they call a hypothetical scenario, if we were asked to deliver high-speed broadband in the intervention area, how it could do so and the estimated cost. And the letter also reiterates positions advanced by AIR when participating in the NBP process around governance, how the contract imposes obligations over and above those required by regulation, concerns around the risk of contagion, where regulatory equivalence could force AIR to offer what it considers more onerous services and prices across the country as a whole. So these are things that we would have engaged with AIR on in the period leading up to their withdrawal from the process in January 2018. I suppose there's a few critical points that are probably worth drawing out and maybe saying a bit about, and I'll ask colleagues to come in on this. The whole issue of governance and the constraints, as they call them, what they call complex and onerous provisions, we characterise them as obligations and sound governance mandated by state aid rules and mandated by contract law, and particularly important when you are talking about how we protect 2 billion of taxpayers' money. I mean, the system that operates in the AIR 300K is designed for a commercial intervention where you have a commercial company spending its own money. We're talking about spending 2 billion of taxpayers' money. You do need a different model, and you need a model with greater oversight. And I think the aid memoir we sent earlier in the day will be useful in this regard, and I'll ask Fergal to say a bit about that in a moment. The other thing that came through in evidence last week, and I think it was raised again by deputies in the discussion with ESB, was the AIR overbuild and why that kind of approach is being taken by the bidder in terms of whether you should reuse the AIR 300K infrastructure, what happens if you do it in a particular way, whether additional cost is incurred, what the technology impacts and constraints are, and so forth. And again, that was the subject of the document you received from Analysis Mason this morning, and I'll ask Patrick to come in on that momentarily. And another point which I think is really important and generated a lot of discussion from looking back at the transcripts. Deputy Dooley in his discussion with Comreg raised this particular issue about the nature and cost of connections in the 300K intervention area, the approach that has been taken there, and what we're doing in the 300K area and what we're doing in the NBP intervention area. And I think it's important that we kind of tease out the differences and why we're doing that. So maybe if I ask Fergal to talk a bit about the governance, because he's spent the last 4 or 5 years of his life in the bowels of this.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Carlick, deputies, Senator. So I suppose there's been a lot of discussion over recent weeks, and I suppose in particular from bidders around the process, because they were involved in it for a long time, since 2015, and in the end 3 bidders have spent a huge amount of money on the process with us. We've spent a huge amount of money on the process, and there's been large teams, I suppose 4 teams involved in this for long periods of time. Our own team, 50, 60, 70 people at different periods. And then bidders had large teams, as you heard from the ESB last week. They had large teams from ESB, Vodafone, Cyro, and Eircom had large teams on it, and the current bidder has a large team on it still. So I suppose the extent of those teams obviously gives you an indication of the amount of work that's required on this process since 2015 in terms of the technical aspects of it, the commercial aspects of it, and the legal aspects of it. I suppose Eircom in particular, as the dominant player in Ireland, would probably say they were faced with more challenges than others. And what I will do now is explain the challenge that an incumbent operator would have in any process like this. It's not new in Ireland, it's the same in every member state around the world. When you're an incumbent and you're a dominant player in the provision of pole and duct access, in particular in the passive infrastructure, when you own that and you're regulated, you come with strict conditions on it. I suppose one document which eventually came out of Comreg in the middle of 2018 was around this contagion issue that Eircom would have alluded to last week, and it was an ongoing discussion with lots of correspondence shared between bidders and Eircom and the department since 2017 on this risk of contagion. Now, the net point in contagion played into our governance process, because I suppose what we were required to do, and what I'll do is I'll refer you to the state aid guidelines, which really played into this governance process that we've set out, because the Bible that we've had to follow since the get-go, and was followed since 2015 when we set out the strategy, because the strategy had to align to state aid guidelines. For example, the state aid guidelines would say you must have a wholesale open access company. So therefore the strategy had to land on an open access wholesale company, for example. And then that wholesale open access company must offer services on equivalent terms. Again, that's in the state aid guidelines. These are common practice in regulation. You have to follow those sort of things. Now, when you're an incumbent, though, and when you own infrastructure, there's a particular paragraph in the state aid guidelines, and it's section 78, and it's paragraph F. Now, when you're an incumbent and when you own the infrastructure, what the state aid guidelines say you must do as an incumbent is, if you enter a procurement process, you must allow the other bidders equal access to your infrastructure, otherwise you cannot tender. Now, it's a short paragraph, I'm going to read it out, but the point I'm going to make, when you look at this small paragraph, the amount of work and complexity that brought into our process was absolutely enormous for all bidders that owned infrastructure. That included the ESB, by the way, and ENET, because they all owned infrastructure that other bidders might want to pick and choose. And because reuse of infrastructure was so critical to reduce the cost of the state, we were obliged as a department to bring all that infrastructure into one bucket, I suppose, and say to anybody that wants to bid, that's the infrastructure that's available, and you can all pick and choose the infrastructure you want to use, depending on your network design, and you select the most cost-effective solution. And if you're a participating bidder, all bidders were required to set up a separate independent ring-fence team on their infrastructure with Chinese walls. So I'm just going to briefly read it. It says here, any operator which owns or controls infrastructure, brackets, irrespective of whether it is actually used in the target area, which is our intervention area, and wishes to participate in the tender, should fulfil the following conditions. 1, to inform the aid granting authority, which is us, and the NRA about the infrastructure during the public consultation. To provide all relevant information, which is a critical point, and it plays into the Analysis Mason document that was sent today. All relevant information to other bidders at a point in time which would allow the latter to include such infrastructure in their bid. Member States should set up a national database on the availability of existing infrastructures that could be reused for broadband rollout. Now, we did all that. We set up in our procurement documentation in 2015 the rules that applied to these companies, because we were required under state aid rules. And we had to tell the European Commission that we followed all these rules. Otherwise, you wouldn't get state aid approval. And that did add a layer of complexity for anybody that owned infrastructure. And clearly, that added a layer of complexity to Eircom that others may not have had. ESB did have that, but they're not regulated in telecoms. Obviously, Comreg. Now, while Eircom were happy to do that because they're regulated, it did introduce this contagion problem that you talked about. Now again, we had, I suppose, a level of sympathy towards their argument that if we do something under this paragraph for bidders in the intervention area, such as give them a discount on a poll price, or such as give them better terms and conditions, there's a risk that Comrie will make me do that in Dublin. Okay? Now, we were at pains to say, and I have a little bit of experience in regulation to say, I'm not really sure where you're getting at with that contagion argument. And they said, well, I have a non-discrimination obligation. I have to treat everybody equally across the country. And that was debated to and fro. I think I have a letter that in January 2017, I said, I don't believe that's an issue. I think that's taken that obligation or that's imposed on you a bit too far. I think you should talk to Comrie. I think you should talk to DG Comp and DG Connect and see if that's actually true. And I suppose where that landed, which was nearly a year and a half later, where Comrie published an information notice, Comrie document 1851, where they said, heirs' obligations to act in a non-discriminatory manner means it is to apply equal conditions in equal circumstances to other undertakings, providing equivalent services and to service and information to others under the same conditions and of the same quality as the operator provides its own services or those with subsidiaries or partners. That's the obligation that Eircom was interpreting to say, if I do something for MBP Co or bidders in MBP land, I'll probably have to apply that to everyone else across the country. And what Comrie did was they published a specific information note saying that's not true. You don't have to apply that obligation in the NBP world because NBP world is different. Now, since then, and that was after Eircom left the process. So the contagion issue, I think, and I said this to Eircom many times during the process, I thought it was a red herring. I don't believe you have that contagion problem. I don't believe the Commission believe you have it. I don't believe Comrie believe you have it. But as Ms Lennon said in her letter, her legal advisor said she had. And that put them in a difficult position. Now, I wasn't acting as her legal advisor, nobody else was. But I think that played into the issues and the red lines that they were talking about, that the rules of our game, which is in line with stated guidelines, presented them with a commercial issue to their commercial business. That, for example, if NBP Co orders 1.2 million polls off me and it's €20 a poll, I suppose we would have said, well, I think if you're buying one poll, if you're buying 1.2 million polls, it's reasonable to assume that you should probably get a discount. Okay? Eircom said, no. Under regulation, I'm not allowed to do that. And we said, well, that doesn't seem appropriate or fair to us in an NBP state-aided context. And that took over a year and a half to resolve, that one single point. Subsequent to that, there was a discount given on polls for the 1.2 million polls, which was a substantial amount of money, in fairness to Eircom. And that's still under review, but that's a regulated product, and Cormac still has to do reviews of all those polls and ducks and come to view and all those sort of things. But I suppose when people talk about the complexity of the process, in particular the complexity on Eircom, because I think ASB last week said they understood the complexity, but they thought it was fair, it was in line with the rules of the game. The current bidder clearly, it's playing by the rules and it's stuck by the rules and hasn't diverged in the rules so far. But Eircom obviously thought the rules, well, I wouldn't say unfair, but difficult, complex, and difficult for them to stay in the process based on those rules. And constraints, as Mark has alluded to, there were constraints. But I suppose every incumbent in the world, when you're dominant and you have dominance placed on you by a regulator, you have constraints. Now, then we would move on, and I suppose Eircom would say, well, okay, I do have constraints in regulation, therefore I don't need these other constraints in your contract. Okay? Because if I'm regulated, that's the rules of the game. Again, I mean, in a lot of discussion with Comrade, and we discussed that a lot, and that's why the aid memoir we're talking about comes into play. The complexity and challenge to bidders is really reflected in this contract. Now, this contract is 1,500 pages or whatever it is. We said we wouldn't give that to you yet, but what I'm trying to do on this is
appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, what this contract is, and yes, we, I believe you me, our team and 3 other teams, and we have suffered this contract for 3 years, 4 years, and nobody asked for it. It is sticking by procurement law, it's sticking by state aid law, it's sticking by contractual law. It's a contract, it's a commercial contract that needs to be commercially enforceable within the department, through commercial court or whatever. I suppose what we're doing, we're covering every nook and cranny of the contract. We're making sure on behalf of the state it's tight. If we ever unfortunately do end up in a commercial court with any commercial company, it needs to be tight. You need to be able to enforce it. You need to be able to penalise companies if they breach rules of the contract. So, from that perspective, the regulation versus the contract is what we need to understand. Okay? In an SLP environment, Comreg hands down obligations on a commercial company. There's no state aid involved. There's no requirement under regulation for any company to spend any money. There's no requirement in the state to spend any money. So when Comreg hand down regulations, it's based on the status quo, and it's based, maybe Eircom will invest. Eircom invested in the 300k. They invested in the knowledge that to be regulated, but they negotiate the type of regulation that would be with Comreg, and I think that landed on regulation there last October on the terms and conditions of that regulation. Again, if Comreg finds that regulation is breached and they find it non-compliant, the next stage is the commercial court. It's a very difficult process in regulation, and it doesn't cover many of the things that we have in our contracts. So you go into the clauses and the schedules in our contracts. So, for example, I'll give you the deployment schedule. We have a deployment schedule. I'll take you through this, which is, it's on, to get to even schedules in this document. You get to page, what is it? It's 13 before you get to the schedules, and that's the body of the requirements. The clauses are normal contractual clauses you see in any typical contract. So when people say the contract is complicated, the first 13 pages there are standard contractual terms that you'll get in typical PPPs, in the BDUK contracts with BT. Most of what was in those clauses or was in the National Broadband Scheme contract with 3 back in the day. It's a mixture of those, but it's obviously gone through iterations to be tailored for the MVP process. So that's the clauses. But on page 13, you'll see, for example, we have a schedule there, it's number 97, Schedule 2.3. Now, Schedule 2.3 called Deployment Requirements. That requires the bidder to stick to milestones, quarter by quarter, year by year, for 25 years of what they have to do and when they have to do it. And if they don't do X, Y, and Z, they won't get paid. That's an example of part of this contract that Comreg would have no jurisdiction on under regulation. In Schedule 2.5, there's environmental obligations. Again, Comreg would not hand down environmental obligations under regulation. That's just dealt with by county councils. Schedule 2.6, there's demands on this bidder to set out a communications plan, demand simulation plan, and a brand plan. Comreg would have no jurisdiction on that. Schedule 5.2, for example, which is on the next page, that's just picking out things. We can go through it in more detail. Schedule 5.2 sets out wholesale prices and benchmarking and product rules. Again, we benchmarked what Comreg does. The key point in that one is Comreg has no role with regard to affordability. And we can talk about connection charges later on. Comreg have no role when it comes to affordability of pricing to end users. It is there to regulate whatever costs Eircom believe it costs, that those are efficiently incurred costs, but they have no role in the current regulatory regime to say those prices are capped. You cannot charge anybody X, Y, and Z. It's subject to retail minus rules, and on connection charges, it's subject to a different rule that was decided last October, where Eircom put forward a proposal. Comreg didn't intervene, and people can be charged multiple €170 depending on whether they change retail providers. So, in essence, the current connection charge is more than €170. It's multiples of that depending on how many switches you make. So, there's many different rules in the regulation, covered for different reasons compared to a state-aided project. And again, of course, under state aid, Comreg has no role to review how much money is spent by the bidder on behalf of the state. It has no role to claw back money. It has no role to monitor any of that money. So it has no legal powers to do any of that. Its legal powers come from regulations handed down by Europe when people are designated with market power absent state aid. So that's a critical point in terms of... Now, for Eircom, that absolutely adds another layer of complexity for them as a business, because not only are you dealing with a complex regulatory framework, which I remember back about a number of years ago, I was sitting in a boardroom with a previous CEO of Eircom, and he hadn't long joined. And I remember he said, it was like walking into the cockpit of a plane, never flying a plane before. Regulation was so complicated. But regulation and the regulatory framework handed out to telecoms operators is a complicated area. Now, we have reflected a lot of that complicated area in a contract because it's necessary, but unfortunately with the state aid rules handed down by the Commission, there's another layer of complexity added onto that you have to contract. So nobody asked for the process to be complicated. Nobody asked for it to be long. Nobody asked for it to be expensive. But unfortunately, the rules from the European Commission, the rules of procurement law to ensure a level playing field and equal access to a procurement process by everybody that wants to participate, if they qualify, lend itself to a very complicated and difficult process. And I mean, I suppose in 2015, the infrastructure access piece there, allowing all bidders access to infrastructure, be it ESB, Eircom, ENET, masts or towers or whatever it was, equal access to everybody, was a really complex area to get under. Now, the consequence of not doing that job properly was that nobody would have bid, because they will say, well, there's no infrastructure to use and I don't know what the pricing is, I don't know what the products are, how can I design a network? Now, we'll come to the overbuild of the 300k, or what was suggested an overbuild, and I think that plays into that issue of bidders cannot bid on something if they don't have clarity on products and pricing, and that makes it very difficult. And I suppose in terms of wholesale access on number G, what we've also referred to, or what's been referred to by AIR, is this added complexity of added standards of service that needs to be applied. Again, we dispute the added level of service, but again, under state aid rules, paragraph G of the same section 78, wholesale access, it says, in principle, subsidised companies, which is different to regulated companies. Subsidised companies should provide a wider range of wholesale access products than those mandated by NRAs under sectoral regulation to operators who have significant market power. In this case, it will be AIR. Since the aid beneficiary is using not just its own resources, but taxpayers' money to deploy its own infrastructure, such wholesale access should be granted as early as possible before starting the network operation. That would include dark fibre, full unbundling, virtual unbundling access, bitstream, and all this suite of products that retailers and wholesalers would expect this network to provide. And if you want to deviate from that, the European Commission will say no, you can't deviate from that because it's state aid. Now, when you're in a regulatory environment, a regulator and an incumbent can generally negotiate because you need to reach an outcome. So again, we were somewhat shackled, and I think that is the word, shackled, but appropriately so, because there's state aid involved with the rules of the European Commission. Now, if Ireland went to the European Commission, which we did, and we said, do you really need that? Do you really need this? I mean, the first thing they'll say, well, if we said you didn't need to do it Ireland, we'd have to tell Germany and France and Italy the same thing. So sorry, the rules are the rules, and they were set out in 2013. They're a legal instrument as far as the Commission are concerned, so they don't deviate from those rules, and therefore they won't allow a member state to deviate. Now, we then have to get a European Commission state aid decision. Otherwise, you cannot spend any state aid. And until that decision is awarded to Ireland, which I said we expect it will shortly, then you can't spend state aid. So it's a circular thing. You could say we don't really have to abide by these rules, but then you'll never get a state aid decision. And part of the state aid rules is you need to run a thorough open access procurement process, and you make sure it can be competitive. Now, they do make provisions also that in the event that it's not competitive, and they provide for that because across all of Europe there's been processes where it has not been competitive. And we've used the UK example before, but it's across the board. I think I saw a presentation 7 or 8 years ago from DG Comp. They said 80% of state aided projects went to incumbents. Okay, so the rule of thumb was the incumbent generally won. It holded all the cards, you know, and that's normally what happens in a process because they have maybe economies of scale and scope, and they have an advantage over others. And I suppose the state aid are trying through these rules to rebalance that. And it places a big burden on member states to try and do that. And that's exactly what we did. We did it by their rules. And I suppose today we have an operator who doesn't own the poles and ducts, who is entering a process to use those poles and ducts, and they're regulated. They're taking comfort in the fact they're regulated, and they're going to go forward and propose to build a network on those poles and ducts. Now, again, in terms of how the Commission say you deal with a single bidder process, it's of the same thing. It's paragraph I, and they say that monitoring and clawback mechanisms are an absolute requirement. So you must monitor, and that's back to the onerous obligations on our contract in terms of clawback. So in the event when they envisage a single bidder situation, like in BDUK and everything else, and in the event of that, they say, however, quote, where future costs and revenue developments are surrounded by a high degree of uncertainty, which some might say they are here, and there is a strong asymmetry of information, which with a department and network operators and providers in the market, they're the experts, we're the authority. Sometimes there can be an asymmetry of information. The public authority, i.e. us, may also wish to adopt a financing model that are not entirely ex ante, but rather a mix of ex ante and ex post. Example, assuming clawbacks such as to allow balanced sharing of unanticipated gains. Now, again, as Marcus said, we have a £2 billion subsidy to the bidder. We have our contingency and set aside for 480 million. And that's all based on a very thorough, and we've explained it before, clawback mechanism on build costs, on unanticipated gains by the operator in terms of excess profits, and on the value of the business at the end. And I mean, that's part of the process. Now, the Commission don't set out what percentages you have. They said it's up to the Member State to negotiate the best possible percentages, which we believe we have under the circumstances, while balancing up the incentives for the operator to maximise the output of the network and to maximise even the success of the network on a commercial basis. So, I suppose we would say unfairly, to some extent, people have alluded to the fact that it's been an unnecessarily complex process. It's been unnecessarily protracted. It's been unfair to some bidders. We don't believe so. We believe it did require substantial bidders with deep pockets probably to be able to bid, and that has cost a lot of money. I think that's just the nature of the process. We're still at it, obviously, after 2016, 2017, 2018, and I think said there's nothing we have done that nobody else wouldn't have to do in other Member States.
Well, the other important point on that is that we don't believe that the extent of the additional burden that was placed on AIR by virtue of the contract was of the order that they seemed to suggest at the hearings last week. I mean, they seemed to suggest that we required whole separate teams. They couldn't use their existing wholesale team of 80 staff and that sort of thing. But that wasn't the case, and we obviously needed a clear line of sight for the 2.1 billion that would be channeled into whatever entity won the contract. And that was a critical piece, but it didn't mandate a duplication of systems, staff, or other infrastructure in the AIR organisation. So you may want to comment on that further.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So again, I suppose if I could refer you to the Eamon Ryan contract, and I'll go back to the 101. It's number 101. It's Schedule 2.7 on this, and it's called NVPCO requirements. And I think this really is the area where AIR, for example, would allude to this was an unnecessarily duplicated process for them, given that they were regulated. So this is the area where we did require a separate board. We did require a minister's appointee. We did require senior management that was ring-fenced for the network that we needed to build. And it's fair to say that over the course of 2016 and 17, that there was significant engagement with ourselves and AIR in particular, because of the unique nature of being regulated in the market, having an open AIR access team already in place. We went through a lot of workshops with them to make sure that they could maximise the open AIR team while respecting these provisions in this contract. The provisions in this contract of having this special purpose vehicle for MBP only was set out in 2015 in the government decision on the strategy. It was set out in the requirements of the tender documents, which all preferred bidders, all pre-qualified bidders signed declarations to follow, including AIR. They didn't necessarily disagree that they wouldn't set up a special purpose vehicle. Where we ended up having a debate, I suppose, and a very healthy debate, was the spirit in which they would apply that special purpose vehicle, in terms of what did the board mean, what were the terms of reference of that board, would there be a minister's appointee on it, or what would their role be, and what was the relationship between the NPV SPV board and the AIR board. Would the AIR board tell the board of the NPP company, well, you've got X money this year and X money next year because we're a bit short in cash this year? How did that all work? So these are the type of discussions we had. They did raise issues that there was duplication of technical platforms and gateways and systems and billing systems. And my colleague Pat here is the technical officer in the department. Spent many a workshop with the AIR technical team saying, we're not sure that's right. We are actually requiring you to reuse all that infrastructure. And at the end of the workshops, they agreed, okay, we can use all that and it works fine. We just need to tweak some things to make it NBP-coable. So much of the duplication that they were referring to, we didn't agree with at all. We said, we want you to maximise your economies of scale. We do not want you to waste state money. But with regard to this schedule, We do think the independent board is important. We think the senior management for NBPCO is important, to have a CFO and a CEO and a CTO dedicated to the massive build, as alluded to by the ESB, 2 fibre cable loops around the world. We thought a standalone team was justified for that. And of course, if after 10 years that was no longer necessary, again, in this contract, there's a significant contract in place here. It's in number 113. It's called Change Control Procedure. Massive part of the contract, which sets out where things are going well and everything's going according to plan. There's every opportunity for the winning bidder to seek changes to make things more efficient. But given the situation we're in today, we're going into somewhat the unknown, and it's critically important, given the amount of state subsidy involved, that this board was answerable to the minister, and this board had a minister's appointee, and this board was responsible to oversee the money in. Now, what Eircom, I think, in the end we're saying is, well, will it impact my ability to compete nationally? I want to sell service at a national level, so if Sky walk in my door and they want a national product, or Vodafone, or anyone else, I don't want to be going through this nonsense of selling with Open Air and selling with MBPCO. And we said, that's fine. Tell me how you're going to sell using Open Air's brand, but we want clear discrepancies between what MBPCO's revenues are, so we can manage the clawback and trace the money, versus everything being sold from MBPCO into Open Air. There was a difference of opinion on that, no question. And we believe that was resolvable and on the cusp of being resolved just before Eircom went through. So of the 10 red line issues that they sent in a letter to us just the week before they withdrew, or the same day, I'm not sure which it was, they presented 10 areas that were an issue. I looked at them there, I think it was over the last few days, to see where did we still have an issue. I think that issue of can MBPCO sell into Open Air and Open Air sell to the current country, we had an issue with that in terms of transparency and traceability and the independence of the MBPCO board versus Eircom board. But that was on the cusp of being resolved. I don't think that was a big hurdle to get over. The duplication of resources, we don't agree with them in terms of saying we wanted 80 people over in MBPCO. We wanted a board, we wanted a senior management, an administration team. It was going to be an incremental cost, no question of that, but we thought it was a cost worth paying to make sure that a team was sitting on this contract to manage it for 25 years or 10 years. Again, change control, that could have been amended once it was all proven and tested and everything was going according to plan. And then, I suppose they had an issue. We had a risk that all their contractors they used nationally, that they could in some way cross-subsidise or take money from us and pay K Networks in Dublin or different things like that. And they refused to say you can impose a clawback mechanism, say, on a contractor that we use across the country. Again, I think that was going to be resolved. It's since been, it's no longer there, it's no longer necessary because of the mechanism we have in place with subcontractors. We had a red line on the ring-fence funding. We did want Air to commit funding to the project and have it guaranteed in writing. That we weren't landed on that. I think according to Air it was going to be difficult to land on that. So that was a red line that hadn't moved. And I think, again, the contagion issue I mentioned, that was a fundamental factor that I think the information notice from Comrie came out in June 2018. They left in January. I don't know if that information notice would have kept them in the process. That's a matter between Comrie and Eircom and the Commission. But again, as I would have said to them frequently in 2017, I didn't believe their position on the contagion was altogether right. I don't believe it was the risk that they perceived it to be. But I suppose if you're in their shoes and you're a business, maybe they took a different view. I think the other areas that they had red lines on was we need more time in the contract. We were trying to push all bidders to get to a final tender. We had issued a letter to them around about that week saying, you know, we're open to talk, we're open to more dialogue. So I think the timing issue wasn't necessarily an issue. And then at the time, but it's again been since resolved with Comrig, there was issues around equivalence of inputs. Did they absolutely have to give everyone equivalent of inputs? It's since been accepted by Eircom through a Comrig decision in October that they do. But before Comric made that decision, they were disputing that with my colleague here, saying there's certain things we don't believe it's necessary to have equivalence inputs on, and that was down as one of their red line issues. But that's disappeared because Comric has imposed that on them anyway. And then there's certain products that the European Commission would require us to have in our product set in this contract, such as dark fibre, access and stuff like that, which I'm not sure if they offer that under regulation, but I think Eircom had raised that as a red line, saying in rural areas they thought that was a bit of a load of nonsense offering dark fibre. And I think, again, that was under discussion. I don't believe that would have been a red line in the end. So, again, the red lines that Eircom had put forward, I think the contagion issue was one of the big ones. The duplication of resources, I don't think was a big one. And the ability to sell nationally with their national platform, I don't think it was a big issue. And it was on the verge of being resolved before they left.
Thank you. Mr. Neary, you didn't want to come in there, or come in through questioning if you want. Can I just ask, what did Air bid while they were in the process? What was their...
Yeah. Provisions of the process of the...
Yeah. What did they... During the... What was their bid during the process?
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, I'll explain that again.
Sorry,
maybe in less than a half an hour.
Sorry, yeah. No, in fairness, I asked a question and I want to give them a chance to come before us. Yeah.
So again, it was referred to last week as a technical submission. In September 2017, two bidders. Now, in August 2017, Cyro left, but Cyro had all but got a draft submission ready, which we had seen many aspects of it. In 2017, two bidders submitted a full draft tender. It was not a technical submission. It was a full technical, financial and contractual submission in draft form as a dummy run for the final tender. That's the intent of that. And in that commercial model that was put forward by Air, it presented the 2.7, which is in their letter as of Friday. The 2.7 was exclusive of VAT and any contingencies as far as we're aware of. And that was their starting bid in terms of the process.
Okay. And just very briefly, in relation to the overbuild and putting fibre on top of Air's fibre, can you just talk about the impact, the cost impact for MBI or somebody using Air's infrastructure, laying fibre over it, the overbuild and the cost impact of that, just very briefly?
Analysis Mason did submit a paper to the committee today. I'll just explain briefly what the intent of that was. So when the 300k area was removed, obviously this created, I think ESB referred to it as a donut of premises around towns and villages where bidders are now needed to traverse that area to get to the intervention homes. So this is like 5 or 6 kilometres out the main roads of villages and down partly Boreens, but not all the way down to the end of the premises, to the end of the roads. So bidders are faced with trying to traverse that area, and they considered two options. One was to use an active product that Air were developing, which reused the fibre that were deploying for the 200k, and then the bidder would plug in their own fibre at the end of the 300k area to address the intervention area. Or alternatively, the bidder could use poles and ducts and just rent those poles and ducts from Air to deploy, or use their own infrastructure in ESB's case to get across the 300k area. So both options were network infrastructure sharing. They're reusing infrastructure. In the active wholesale product option, you're renting the fibre, but that includes the cost of the rental of the pole and duct that's holding up that fibre as well, and the active equipment, the electronics that's in the telephone exchanges that Air manages fibre from. In the pole and duct rental option, you're just renting the pole, the physical pole and the duct in the ground, and you have to deploy your own fibre through it. So we spent a lot of time looking at with the bidders the preferred option across which would work best, and what became apparent was that it was different for different bidders. So in the open air case, their preference was to use the active product and plug in the fibre into the fibre that was on the 300k build, whereas for the other bidders it became very apparent that they preferred to just use the pole and duct actual physical infrastructure and deploy their own fibre. And the main rationale for that was that those bidders, demonstrated that due to where their design was starting from, primarily the MANs in Grattan McCord's case and the ESB substations in ESB's case, you didn't get the same cost benefit of using the air fibre based on their topology. At the same time, the cost of the pole and ducts was reduced somewhat through there was based on the volume of poles and ducts that were being used by the bidder, by Grattan McCord in particular. They got a lower price for using the pole and duct infrastructure, so that option became a cheaper option and more cost efficient for them to use. And I think ESB said it in their evidence as well. They felt that it was more cost effective for them to use their own infrastructure. Air, on the other hand, they continued because the design of their network obviously fits directly into where you can access that fibre at their exchanges and at the other end of towards the intervention area, so they could achieve cost savings through using that product. So that was the way Air chose it.
So it's more cost effective to lay fibre on top of Air's fibre, essentially.
Yeah, and there was a number of operational issues that were in existence towards that product, the fibre product at the time as well, and as Mason have listed them out, that product was in development at the time, and really it prevented the other bidders being able to have that assurance of being able to use it in particular locations or not. I should say, though, for MBI now going forward, it is possible for MBI to re-engage and to reuse an Air Active product in their deployment, and if there are cost savings, they could achieve those in certain circumstances, and I suppose that product would need to be redeveloped and introduced to cover future-proofing requirements and the capacity and operational requirements that MBI would need to be able to rely on it in those circumstances. So it's obviously there as an option for them to pursue in the future.
What we've said previously at the committee is when you're looking at a low-level design of individual deployment areas, the NBI will be mandated to come forward with the most cost-effective solution, whether that is use of an FVI product if it's brought back onto the market and is the appropriate one, use of the ESB infrastructure, obviously use of the air and pole duct infrastructure, and again looking at the most cost-effective way of connection charges and wireless infrastructure.
I'm going to go to Deputy Dooley.
For the presentation, a very comprehensive presentation, certainly more comprehensive than the initial department response to the presentation here last week, where the Taoiseach went into the Dáil to indicate that the billion offered was as a result of not including VAT or connection charges, which was subsequently proven to be wrong. So whoever in the press office in the department hastily got that response out, you left the Taoiseach with egg on his face, but that's a matter for yourselves. Look, from a committee perspective, we heard from Air last week that they could provide high-speed broadband access to 542,000 homes and premises and farms dotted throughout the intervention area, which they said they could deliver for $1 billion. Now, we represent the taxpayer, we represent the people who need broadband, and it would be entirely foolish of us if we didn't try to pursue that to the nth degree. So anything that I might say is in the context of that. But it seems to me, based on the presentation, the lengthy responses today, and all the layers of complexity that are involved, and all the rules and regulations that have to be met, that in order to protect that billion, the state is going to have to spend an additional $2 billion to protect $1 billion. Now that seems absolutely ridiculous to the taxpayer, and I'm sure to the person waiting for broadband, because it is the case that Air, who has been getting a little bit of a bashing from the department in recent days, and it often gets a bashing from myself in other areas, you know, are the big baddie out there. But in truth, you entered into an arrangement with them, did you not, to roll out broadband in the intervention area, the original intervention area, covering 300,000 homes. Successive ministers have taken political capital for their foresight to do that. Now, we know what the ESB said and the implications that it had. But I suppose my question is, first and foremost, are we spending 2 billion to protect 1 billion? So that's the first question.
Okay, so first of all, we think the comparison that needs to be made is between what AIR have characterised as their mid-case scenario, which is 1.55 billion, against the NBI contract mid-case scenario, which is 2.1 billion. So there's a difference of about 600 million there, not to be sniffed at quite clearly. Can I take a step back briefly? We have not bashed AIR. I mean, in fact, we've worked very closely with AIR on the AIR 300K. We have a very good relationship at official level with the CEO and with their staff. We're in regular contact with them on a whole range of issues, including their proposals to roll out the fibre network to 1.4 billion in urban areas. What AIR, and this is a point I'm going to ask Fergal to deal with, because I think it's an important one, and maybe the longer presentation we gave at the start, we'll try and tighten that up a bit, because really what we need to be able to say to you is, what are the key differences between rolling out a network in a 300k fashion and rolling out a network of the nature required and the controls required for the National Broadband Plan, and why they're so important? Because I think that's really...
Secretary General, if you want to provide that to us in a written document, we'll
do that, but can we try and capture the essence of it?
But I think we've gotten a good bit of that already.
Okay.
But what I'm trying to get to here is, representing the taxpayers we do, and representing the people who are waiting for it, who are maybe coming to understand now that the length of time that it has taken to do this procurement process is because of all these complexities. Does it not seem to you that that's absolute mission creep beyond belief?
No.
To the extent that it's going to cost an additional 2 billion to really put in place a superstructure around a project which is costing $1 billion.
Yeah, but we would contest that, and I'm not sure how.
Before you contest, maybe take into account the following: Do you have any issues with the 300 and odd thousand homes that have been passed and the number connected already under that arrangement that you've had with AIR? Are you satisfied with what they have delivered?
I'm going to let Mr. Griffin answer the question.
So just another remark. I mean, and I know you don't mean it, Deputy, but there is a kind of an inference that we in the department don't care about value for money. We have been pushing this project for the last 3 years to make sure we maximise value for money for the taxpayer. We have done it under very difficult circumstances in a situation where we were left with one bidder. We're confident we have the controls in place in terms of clawback and all the rest that will actually provide us with a solution that we can roll out reasonably quickly and will still secure value for money for the taxpayer. But the crucial piece here is why can you not roll out the National Broadband Plan in the intervention area in a similar fashion to what AIR have done in the 300k area? And there's some key things that I think we need to call out there, and actually draws us into a conversation on the connection costs as well.
Okay, I'll start off, and Pat here will talk about the technical requirements that we're obliged to put in the form of a contract, which, going back to 2016 and 2017, would have been myself and Pat and others that would have negotiated over the course of about 9 months the commitment agreement, which was a 30-40 page document, compared to our 1,500 page document, which I've explained earlier, is unavoidable. So we certainly can't flip to a 40 page document. I don't know if that's what Eircom is assuming we would do.
And if I could be helpful, because I'm not cutting in on you, so I get that. So then maybe to short circuit this a little bit, AIR introduced this notion of universal service obligation the last day. and I think they cited some, if memory serves me, they cited some examples of where an extension of a universal service obligation. So the state has an obligation, agreement with AIR that connects to every home in the country that wants to be connected through a piece of copper wire. So if it's good enough to get a piece of copper wire to every home, surely that model should be good enough to get a piece of fibre cable to every home. Why would you want to have any more complexity or any more rules or regs or transparency than just making that connection? I don't want to simplify it, but these are the questions that we're being asked, and they're looking at all of us collectively, that we have created this massive superstructure that everybody is looking at everybody, and something that started out potentially costing $500 million is now costing $3 billion. AIR land in and they say, we can do this for $1 billion. We've already done it in the intervention area, a part of the intervention area, where we did it on a commercial basis. Now, I can sit here till tomorrow, I'm sure, listening to Mr. Mulligan, and he'll give fact after fact, which is all correct. The question, I suppose, now is there another model? Is there another arrangement that can be entered into? And, that may require stalling where we're at the moment. But is there another model, knowing everything that you now know? Clearly you didn't at the beginning. Is there another model, through an extension of a universal service obligation, or whatever, that can get us high-speed broadband at the same speeds, the same quality of service, as in the 300,000 area for $1 billion?
Yeah, very quick reference. First of all, just before turning to it, when you're looking at the figures and the gap, and it's absolutely not $2 billion in the first instance. And I think, in fairness to the AIR CEO, like if you look to her testimony, which I've been through, and to the letter, it's very clear to me that what the AIR CEO was doing was trying to be helpful to the committee in responding to a question asked, and saying, taking the example of the 300k, that if you were to continue and roll that out in rural Ireland, what it would cost to do. And was not saying that you would be doing that as the NBP, because once you start to go and do it as the NBP, clearly if there's a cheque coming from the Irish taxpayer to fund that, then with that comes, and I won't go into it, at a minimum level of controls, so as a taxpayer could be sure that in the event that this thing doesn't go to plan, or if the commitments aren't met, that you get your money back or you're protected. So, and when you, again, in fairness, when we asked AIR for further information and they were forthcoming and they quickly responded with information, and it's clear when you look at that, there's optimistic scenarios and there's a mid-case scenario, and we have our hard case scenario. So clearly, like when we're looking for money for a project like this, we talk the max numbers. And we're not going to go into it today here with the optimistic number in terms of if the capital clawback came to our advantage, or if the revenue uptake was higher, what it might be. I think that kind of speculation would not be helpful. In terms of other models, and the USO in particular, there is a USO there for copper, and it's a USO for functional internet access. And I don't know what, if you tried to do it with your phone here today, how it would work, but it's 28 kilobits per second is the functional internet access. So that's what exists in Ireland today. Now, the new European Electronic Communication Code, which it's due to come into force by December of next year, and Ireland argued for this in the context of the development of that directive. It allows member states, it allows for the provision of adequate broadband through a USO. But it's also very clear, the directive is very clear, that it's a hierarchy as to how broadband should be provided in member states. And it begins with, it should be in the first instance, not surprisingly because we operate in a liberalised telecoms market, in the first instance it should be provided by commercial operators. The next way broadband should be provided, the directive provides, is through public policy instruments. So that's absolutely the National Broadband Plan, or it could be your approach to spectrum, auctions, etc. So you use the tools that are available to you. And then very much as a last and third resort, you could have a USO. I understand that this is an area that Comreg would propose to look at when the new code is transposed, and in particular in the light of if the NBP was delivered, to see are there still remaining, because when you read the code it's clear, it's looking to that final percentage, it's looking to ensure that as you move forward, even if you have done the whole country, if it happened that the approach taken in a member state was such that there were new instances of people who actually couldn't get broadband. But then, and I'll conclude on this, if Ireland were to take an approach, so you've got to get the code transposed in December of next year. You'd have to then, for Comreg to do their analysis as to whether or not a USO was appropriate. You then have to engage with the market on this key term of adequate broadband. And when you look to the directive, to the kind of services that you should be able to carry out under the definition of adequate broadband, it would seem that you will be able to do them at a relatively modest broadband speeds. So, like the expectation is, in the UK, for example, there is a USO, it's 10 megabits. So the expectation is that it will be at a low level. And then finally, if you were to go the route of introducing a USO and you've established your adequate broadband level, and you can get it up high enough that it actually will be meaningful and work for you, you actually have to allow market players the opportunity. You can't just designate, you have to allow market operators the opportunity to come forward to offer themselves to be that USO provider.
Well, I'd like to hear Mr. Hoban from that, like, as to why a USO is not possible now. You're saying that it can only be used at a later stage where the market has already been satisfied. But we're proposing to satisfy the requirement by state intervention. So surely that's where USO comes into play, is when there's a needed from a state intervention. So if you stand from today and say, to look at a USO model, leave the NBP aside for the moment, just park it for talk's sake, and to look again at using the USO model. Could that be possibly used to roll out high-speed broadband? Now, because you say minimal levels and adequate levels and all that. Don't forget now that the National Broadband Plan in its initial call only looks for 30 megs, and I've been on record as calling that into concern. I noticed in an earlier by Mr. Griffin, where you talked about proposed by the government, predominantly fibre solution proposed by the government. In fact, to the best of my recollection, it's not fibre proposed by the government because it has to be technology neutral. It was the three bidders.
It was absolutely.
Yeah, and was welcomed.
The contract now.
Yeah, and the contract and was welcomed.
Absolutely.
But the truth of it is, because of the rules as they exist, that couldn't form part of the policy.
No.
But that's what the market players gave back. So what I'm suggesting to you is, you're identifying constraints based on the rules. Those same constraints were there to a large extent in terms of what you could request in your initial documentation from the marketplace. But the market came flooding back and said, we'll give you fibre to the home. Now, I suspect, based on listening to the testimony from Air here last week, that if they were responding, it's in their commercial interest, and it's very clear that it's in their commercial interest to be replacing copper with fibre. I would say that's the case right across Europe from any of the incumbents. So all I can ask, and this isn't us against you or you against us, it's trying to be collaborative on behalf of the people who we all represent to the best of our abilities, as you're doing. Can you go back and take a serious look at the USO, prepare a paper for us that looks at the pluses and the minuses as going in terms of what the implications are. Do the SWOT analysis on a USO versus where we're at the minute.
So we have done some work on that as part of our options papers, which we considered during the course of late last year and early this year. So I'll ask Fergal to maybe to say a bit more about it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Again, I don't want to bore you with facts, but the USO regime has been discussed in detail under the European Communications Code. The European Commission has made it very clear they don't see a USO for broadband as being the silver bullet for fixing member states' broadband market failures. It's very clear in the code, and Comreg have confirmed this to us, as they would be the overseer of USO in the copper context for voice, but going forward it will be the regulators that will be tasked with overseeing it. But that it's commercial investment with public sector investment by the government should be the main vehicle to solve the market failure identified. And the code is quite clear that a universal service broadband, which currently isn't in any legislative process in Europe, there's no standard or anything else other than what you may or may not do for kind of functional internet access or adequate access.
Whilst it may not be in regs in Europe, so long as we don't breach state aid rules, which are distinct and separate.
As a member state can bring in primary legislation, the UK has done it on 10 megabit. We understand from talking to Broadband UK about this, we talked about USO several years ago as part of the strategy, the whole thing, but what are the best options? We talked about it as part of the reappraisal in 2018 when Eircom left, was USO an option. So we have explored this with BD UK. BD UK got a lot of legal advice from General Counsel on what's possible within the framework and within the regulations and local legislation. That led them to a primary legislation instrument saying we will impose a USO obligation, we spoke to them about this, of 10 megabit until such time as the commercial sector, stroke public sector with its funding, with state aid, gets to the area, just as an interregnum until somebody gets 50 meg or 100 meg. Because they could
so that potentially then could have you in a situation where you were
doing both,
competing with wireless or whatever.
You're doing both. Okay. You're funding USO for an interim period. That's what they've done in the UK. We've talked about it.
But is it worth considering at least offering that to the marketplace, and then if Eir are prepared to step into the breach and give us fibre?
Sorry, just before you go on, again, back to the old days of USO, which we're quite familiar with. And the model we have here, which is akin to the USO, what we have in our contract is exactly akin to a USO that you would actually impose. So if Comreg were looking at this, Comreg would be tasked with whatever the policy direction is. Would you set a policy, and this is the question, of 100% coverage at 30, 50 or 100? I think the consensus is 30 is now too low. It should be what we have at the moment is 150 is the market minimum from CSIRO and Eircom. And then Comreg would be tasked with the same job we've just done for 3 years. They would have to go to the market and seek out a provider that's willing to do it, and then they would have to decide how that would be funded. Now, if it was to be funded by $1 million or $2 billion or whatever you call it, a decision would have to be made who's paying for that. And there's no provision under any USO legislation in Ireland as to is it the state who would pay that to the universal service provider, or is it spread among all the operators? Now, I think Eircom at the moment are looking for a very small, in relative terms to our numbers, they're looking for a small amount of money, and it's in the commercial courts under the old USO regime. Now, the old USO regime required Eircom, and it was an automatic designation because of their legacy incumbency in the copper network. The connection charge there for anyone that wanted a copper connection, and I think it's the same now, it has been for about 15 years, it's 117 euros. We're charging 100, so we're not too different. And the consumer paid nothing unless they went over 7,000 of a cost. It was called a regulated access threshold. We have a similar threshold in our contract, but it's 5,000 euros. So the USO model to date versus any likely USO model in the future is very similar to the model we have today. So would you, going into a USO world, reach a different outcome? You couldn't designate Eircom automatically. Vodafone, CSIRO, wireless operators all have to be given the opportunity to seek funding. You're in a procurement process. You're in a new world of that infrastructure problem I just mentioned. Everybody would have to have equal access to the infrastructure to be a designated operator to get funding either from the state or from Comreg to do the job. You're in a circular world of how do you make this work and happen given all the competing operators that want a piece of the pie. So it's difficult.
We've actually done an internal paper on PSO, USO type arrangement. I don't think we've published it, but let us look at that and we can send it to the committee. Because
that'd be helpful.
We have published it, haven't we? Okay, but I mean, we published a lot of stuff and it's buried up there in an internet.
You certainly did.
So we'll send a copy. We'll send a copy to the committee.
That'd be very helpful.
I think. If you don't mind, Deputy, I know we've buried you with a lot of stuff about not the complexity, but the need and the obligations set out in the contract. But there's a few key pieces that I think need to be drawn out, which make it clear why a 300k style approach would not work in the NBP intervention area. And there's about half a dozen things that are worth mentioning there, and I think they're important.
If you could briefly go through them, or I don't know if it's possible to kind of list them out.
I think if we briefly go through them, but again, we'll be coming back in a bit more detail on some of this stuff through the committee.
I'll try and be brief.
I'm sorry. I know it is detailed, and we have you here because of the complexity of it. Thank you.
Again, myself and Pat and many others are very intimately familiar with the 300k agreement. I said we have scars of about 9 months of lawyer-to-lawyer engagement with Eircom to get that agreement, and it was a difficult agreement to get. And I think, while we even got criticism at the time, we were quite proud of getting that agreement, because fundamentally, an objection of Eircom at the start of that was we are not committing to connect people. At the end of that agreement, we got a fundamental commitment that you must connect 95% of the 300k at the standard connection charge, which at the time was €270, and that was a one-off connection. That connection charge is now €170, but I understand from the new Comrig model, or not a Comrig model, the Eircom model that Eircom has, or Comrig has seen but they haven't intervened on, allows them to get up to €460 from the consumer for a connection fee. And that's under a standard connection model. And that's because, I suppose, if you move from Vodafone to Sky, and the average rate of switching is 42 months, so people over the next 10 years will generally switch operators, and I think the Competition Authority and Comrig would welcome that. People want to switch, and it's good for competition. But it means that most homes will end up paying €460, not 170. Again,
they switch so often, is it?
Yeah, I think people switch from Sky to Vodafone to Air, depending on packages and whatnot.
Right.
And Eircom wholesale, nothing to do with Eircom.
But just to be clear now, it's only in the event of somebody switching that cost is incurred.
Yeah, so if I'm in rural Ireland and I ordered a connection, if I'm within 50 metres of the curtilage of the road, because the commitment agreement was only for air codes, and it was by air code, it was very specific. We have the 300,575 or 4 air codes across the country that were in the commitment agreement.
Have you surveyed that area just to establish? Because I mean, I'm hearing from people just a completely separate project altogether, where there's this duplication of air codes, where farm buildings have been assigned air codes, where there's so what level of detailed survey have you done?
So we get all that from the ordnance survey and from the postcode system, where sometimes a farm.
But there's been you've put no footprint in, you've put no boots on the ground to verify that. Okay.
Well, no, we didn't have to. We know from the analysis, sometimes a farm is a business and a home. That's 2 air codes. But we know that. We know that in our current project as well, where there might be an overlap of air codes. So we're not treating the same air code as 2 connections. Or whatever, you know.
There's a refresh to the air codes, comes out every quarter, and we track that closely to see if there's a change. There's issues like that arise.
So the fundamental thing, and I suppose it absolutely was to de-risk, within the commitment agreement, de-risk Eircom of incurring significant capital costs of connecting people. So it was, if the pole is in the road and I need to put the wire into the eaves of the house or an extra pole, then it's likely to be on average €460 to connect.
I want to go back there, because you've just reminded me now. So why would you facilitate me if I'm in the 542,000 intervention area with a better level of service? So in other words, you're going to make it easier for me to switch, because the lesser cost me, than if I live in the 300,000 area. Like, I thought the purpose of this intervention was to level the playing pitch, so that somebody in Haddington Road got the same service if they had fibre to the home as somebody who lived in West Clare or Westport or wherever. The people who I represent want to get broadband. I don't think that they are overly concerned about the rates of switching out afterwards. That'll be a commercial decision they'll make. But I think the objective from the taxpayer's point of view is to get the broadband, is to get high-speed access. What you do afterwards is a choice you make. If you want to switch services, well, pay for it. I have no issue with that, and I suspect most of the people don't.
Okay. Well, I suppose there's the immediate answer to that. I won't go into that decision. It's before the commercial court, as you know. Sky has challenged that decision to allow that recharging. So retailers, I suppose, are not so happy with that regime. So that regime only came into play after we set the rules in our procurement process. So we always had the rule of €100 because that was the rule that existed at the time. I said it's akin to the rule that was there in USO. I suppose you have to look at it from an affordability point of view. If we increase the connection charge from €100 to €200, for example, you might bring in maybe an extra 15 million in revenue in the first 10 years. But where we care about that, Deputy, is we don't want to reduce demand on this network by people seeing a connection charge regime that puts them off connecting, because that actually increases the subsidy. So you might get extra revenue. The more you up the connection charge, you might get short-term revenue for the initial connections you get. But in the long term, you're going to reduce your actual revenue because less people might connect or might take longer to connect. And therefore, the subsidy actually goes up in the business model over 25 years. So the connection model is a red herring from the subsidy point of view. It doesn't get you much more subsidy or lower your subsidy. So you're better off offering the consumer €100 of a connection charge. The point I'm making is, under the 300k model, their average connection cost, and this Miss Lennon said, is around €460. In the intervention area, because it's an average cost model, it's a lot higher than that. If we use the Eircom model, then consumers would be paying €1,000 or more to connect, because we're not within 50 metres of the road. Now, we are not, and Ms Lennon referred to the fact that we're offering ducting into every home. No, we're not. We are offering overhead network the same as Eircom's model. The only difference is we are saying to the consumer, if we can't get you an overhead network connection and you have to have a ducting, there's no alternative, we will subsidise the ducting. We will pay the ducting. We're not going to ask you to get the mini digger out yourself and put the ducting up the garden. But if you give us permission to put the ducting up your garden, we'll do it for you. And that's subsidised. Why are we doing that? Because we think a lot of consumers don't have mini diggers or don't have the opportunity to get a mini digger to go and build a connection for €1,000 or €2,000. And we are subsidising the connection up to €5,000 because there's a lot of homes out there that have broken ducts, can't get overhead, or need an extra 4 or 5 poles to get down there. As Miss Lennon said, a pole costs €600. There's a lot of homes in rural Ireland are not within 50 metres of the border of the road. And a pole is every 40 metres.
The bulk of them have copper wire. The bulk of them have copper wire going in.
Well, let me answer that. I mean, and I live in rural Ireland. I live in rural Ireland. They don't have copper wire because I've built a house in the last 15 years. The majority of young families that built homes in the last 15 years in rural Ireland are using mobiles. I actually looked for a landline, but there was an ESB cable coming across something. I was told, go build your own duct, and I said, well, I'm not paying for that myself. Yeah. What's the point? I'll use a mobile. You know, and that's the way the USO for that worked, where they were supposed to connect to me, but because there was some issue, you know. So it's not as simple as it's been made out to be, of course, because it is a complex process. Now, back to the 300k, there is an issue that Eircom's connection costs are not the same as the intervention area. We know the average cost of connections are much higher than within 50 metres road because we're dealing with every extremity. But the worst extremities, we said 2%, we might have to do wireless, but we are going to connect the rest. So that 100% obligation is the key difference between the 300k. Obviously, the fundamental difference is there's no state aid involved, but forget about that for a minute. Eircom is regulated for, at most, 5 years at a time. So Comreg would confirm we cannot give you any assurances beyond 5 years that you can rely on regulation to regulate Eircom on poles and ducting within a state aid environment. So all the obligations Pat could go through about service quality, future proofing, future capacity, service level agreements, clawback, all those provisions we have in the contract cannot be done through regulation or the commitment agreement. So your whole contract is gone if you do a commitment agreement style thing. And the future proofing was always a tenet to this. Back in April 2014, we said this is a long-term infrastructure investment by the state, and therefore it's a long-term contract. Regulation doesn't do long-term contracts. So that's a key point. Another point in terms of
copper. Go back again. So we just have to keep kind of touching the stone. It worked for the copper wire.
But let me explain. P&T built the copper wire.
I know, but why would you think? And we had a little offering of that from a backbencher here last week, somehow suggesting that Air were about to leave the planet and go do something else. Why would you not expect that Air, or whatever successor it might have, wouldn't want to continue to operate a fibre network that would be put in place as a result of some kind of an arrangement?
It's not necessarily that. It's again, back to my state aid guidelines. You're required to put rules on that. You have to contractually put rules on it, which are not in a commitment agreement, which is a commercial agreement with no state aid. It's a fundamental difference. Therefore, I'm not saying there's anything different. I'm not saying that they're going to run away. I'm not saying that they wouldn't provide a decent level of service, but unfortunately...
But is that not something that could be encompassed in a universal service obligation and an agreement attached? Like,
if you had a USO for 10 megabit,
if
you had a USO for 10 or 20 or 30 megabit, I'm not sure you're achieving the same outcome as your policy objective.
why can't it be fibre?
Broadband.
In a USO environment, you can't obligate somebody to do something with fibre in the event that it's inadequate.
I think, neither could you in the other one. We're back to the same thing that Mr. Hoban answered already. You didn't call for that. You didn't call for fibre because you couldn't in the initial request for proposals in your consultative dialogue. And yet everybody that was in the market, well, the two incumbents and the new co, all offered fibre because it was, from their point of view, it was the best investment from their perspective.
I think on that, though, we didn't call for fibre.
No.
But what we did call for was a long-term approach, one which will have to be upgraded over time, has to be future-proofed, and you're not coming back to have a second bite at it or finding people are falling off a service in 3 or 5 or 7 years' time. And it was by taking that long-term approach, the market reacted to it, and they reacted in a positive manner. If you took a minimalist, adequate USO approach, which it's clear in terms of the regulations, you're looking at 2020 and you're looking at the expectation that there's government intervention, first of all, the state intervenes. But even if you were taking such an approach, it would be a minimalist approach and you'd have to be coming back again. And I think that's something that's absolutely been at the core of the NBP and has been accepted as being a positive of the approach. It might have made it more complex, but for all of the bidders in the process was, by taking that long-term approach, we were getting a better outcome.
Thanks for that. In the interest of thing, I'll pass on because I have some more questions, which, if it's okay, I might just submit to you, and maybe you can come back to me. But just to
Thank you, Deputy.
give everyone a fair share of time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Deputy Ryan.
Just in relation to Mr. Hoban, we've had some very interesting hearings. I think a lot of the presentations are really good, including, it was in private session, the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, but also the analysis from Analysis Mason. It wasn't a long-term vision that forced us to look to fibre at every house. It was that we have the lousiest planning system on the planet in terms of we just allow houses everywhere, and particularly along roads. Everyone develops a site along the road, and therefore the only way you can get to the house is fixed wireless won't work because we've just got sprawl everywhere. The only way you can get is going from house to house with fibre. That's why we've ended up with fibre, not because it's a long-term approach. Well, it's clear as day from the presentation analysis. I don't know if any of the officials disagree with that, but that's what Analysis Mason said, why we ended up with fibre.
Well, definitely it's a contributor, yeah. But I think the main issue is that over a long period, the initial high capex that you have to deploy for fibre has a much lower operating cost over a long period, and then it becomes more cost effective.
Yeah, but
so
you couldn't even consider fixed wireless, which would be the other alternative, which is also evolving. And
no, but you could consider a higher mix, maybe, of fixed wireless. So,
but the main reason not is because of the topography of our sprawl development model.
That is a big contributor, correct.
And the fear I have is, Deputy Dooley said earlier on that Taoiseach was misinformed. When I asked him about this in the Dáil, he was saying, oh, you have to be careful here, you don't disadvantage one part of the country versus the other. The truth is we are advantaging one-off housing. This is what the Secretary-General of Public Expenditure was one of his concerns, that we're saying we're going to have another 60,000 houses, which we put in the books in this, which is going to be maybe 5,000 grand a house, ducting, and that's not even along the road, because there was a very interesting map from the ESB showing Air taken out most of the road-based stuff. We're left with the stuff beyond the road. And if anything, what we're doing is really giving a very good deal for rural Ireland. But let's be honest and clear about this. This is a gold-plated standard for the most rural houses compared to my constituents. Don't get any of the £5,000 grant and don't have fibre to anyone's house.
Well, they will get it in the commercial sector. Just a couple of points on that. I mean, I think we're long past the situation of trying to re-engineer rural Ireland. I mean, we're presented with a situation where there are several 100,000 homes in rural Ireland that are entitled to be provided with an infrastructure that is required for the things they need to do. The extra 60,000 houses, that you refer to, whatever figures are contained in the projections under the National Broadband Plan, are consistent with Project Ireland 2040 and the growth levels that are predicted there. Project Ireland 2040 looked at a level of growth within Dublin, the 5 major cities, within the county towns and so on, and there was a proportion of growth that was allocated to rural Ireland. So we are not proposing to build at levels that are foreseen, that are beyond what is envisaged under Project Ireland 2040. And what you will see, for example, in the urban areas that you refer to, are a commitment from AIR that they will provide a fibre overbuild over the next 5 years to Dublin, all the major cities, and I don't know how many other towns on top of that. So there's about 1.4 million premises that will get a fibre overbuild from the commercial sector.
And listen, just to be clear, I don't have an objection to the fundamental principle that we have high quality broadband to every house. I absolutely, it's a basic, I agree with that. But just to be honest and straight in what we've heard is the reason we're doing fibre isn't because it's long term, it's because of the sprawled model. And the reason for some of the costs is because of the sprawled model. And 60,000 is a lot of additional sprawl because it's outside the 340,000 area and it's at the very end of just more of the same. And I actually have a fundamental problem with Project Ireland 2040. I believe it is a continuation of a sprawled development model. So that is a difference between us. I think it's fundamentally opposed to our climate ambitions and also but I want to move on to the technicalities because what Air was saying, it's interesting. I mean, that's very interesting, this issue about the €100 versus €170 connection charge. I tend to agree with Deputy Dooley. I think you could complicate that by adding in further future switching. I think it's better to straight up compare the 100 versus 170, and that's an example where it is an advantage to be now in at the further out, the most rural, versus the 340,000 area. But the other one that I'm interested to ask you about, Air cited the fact that the service level standards, and I can't remember the exact figures where they were saying the next day repair service within the 340,000 area was at 85% repairs in that next day, whereas in the new national broadband area it's 95%, was it?
90% was the figure.
90%, sorry, yeah. Well, let's say take those two factors.
Well, that they're incorrect in saying that because actually it's 85% in the NBP area as well, and has been since the very start when they were in the procurement process.
Okay, so that's not correct what they said in that. Because I was going to ask the question of this, another question then, and they might have a chance to correct that. They should be correcting that if they've given incorrect figures. Just to explain in layman's terms, because it is complex, where the Chief Executive of AIR was in last week saying it's $1 billion, we'd do it for, and in fact it could be less. But as you say, and I'm reading the letter where they have the ISDS subsidy requirement together with alternatives, and it's complicated because you've got an absolute subsidy and present value subsidy, and you said that their maximum range subsidy of 1.549 million is actually their mid-range subsidy. I don't understand that.
Well, they've called it their mid-range subsidy. We didn't call it that. Trying to find exactly in the paper. Yeah, so on page 8 in the table, mid-range subsidy 1.54 million. I can't read that page number. 6, I beg your pardon. Yeah, middle-aged and bad eyesight. So there's a table there which shows the ISDS submission, lease subsidy, mid-range subsidy. Now, I don't know whether that suggests that there's an upper level again, or whether that's the 2.75. So we see that as comparing to what our mid-range subsidy was, which is a 2.1 billion figure. So there's a difference there.
What's your least subsidy?
Our lease subsidy.
Can I explain that? Well, again, we deal in maximum terms, as I think Kieran said earlier. We don't want to speculate, but I think I can be quoted saying at the previous committee that of the 2.6 billion which is the gross maximum that bidder might get, I have said that we would be reasonably optimistic or hopeful that over the period of the next 10 or 12 years that we would get up to $1 billion off that number, where the bidder achieves savings, take-up was better than we expected, the rollout plan goes as planned, and materials subcontractor sector come in on price.
So yours might be 1.7 billion in that. Is that figure broad?
Optimistically.
Optimistic. So the comparison with lease subsidies is they're saying leased is 512 million. The comparison with that would be 1.7 if very broad, very stuck. Now that doesn't include the 250 million cost of the department monitoring this, does it? No. So that's that would bring her up to close to 2. You still have a 1.5 billion difference between those two.
So the 250, and it commented on in the Air letter that the 250 or the 10 million annual oversight was a big deterrent for them. Now the reality is we didn't mention a 10 million annual oversight until we actually published the suite of documents when we moved to preferred bidder. Now that isn't an additional cost. The purpose of the oversight arrangements we put in, whether it's 5 or 10 million, and it'd be a mixture of departmental staff and some external advisors, the purpose of that is to drive down the cost. So it's not 3 billion, which is the outer extreme, plus 250 million. The funding of that will be met within the overall provision for the National Broadband Plan, and the only purpose of that oversight and governance unit within the department is to drive down costs, to make sure that we are all over the procurement process in terms of subcontractors, fibre, we're managing the clawback, most efficient design, all of that. That's the purpose of that, and if you have that in place, you achieve savings. If you don't, you don't.
I just mentioned because there is a possibility if you had, hypothetically here now, gone with the USO model, in effect Comreg would be doing that job in those circumstances. You'd effect the USO wouldn't see it as a regulated, Comreg to a certain extent would already have the capability or the teams in place to manage that. There might be a cost saving in that regard that you'd have Comreg rather than the department doing it.
No, I mean, quite familiar with Comreg and its resourcing, and I mean they're bursting at the seams at the moment with work, and they're continually looking for more resources from my colleagues here, and they were in the committee here lately saying they'd been allocated, I think, how many more recently, 40 or 50 extra resources which they're currently recruiting, and in a difficult environment that it is, trying to recruit people in the market that we have, so they are absolutely not resourced to deal with. If it was the same project of 500,000 homes and a USO designation laid down by legislation, any primary legislation that would require Comreg to do that, I can be pretty sure we'll also have to bring with it, well, what would be the additional cost to Comreg? There would be a significant additional cost to Comreg. Okay,
last question I have, Chair, if I can. And I suppose, in the sense, this intervention by AIR last week has turned the tenor of our investigation to a certain extent, but I still get the previous presentation we had from the University of Limerick professors, and it was very compelling, and I suppose I go back to my core concern here. The question was always along the lines we were working towards, was whether a gap model or concession model was the appropriate approach. And to a certain extent, even what was said here earlier on today about, you know, that the state is the investor here, the state is the one taking all the risk, the state is the one putting in all the money. I still, given, I'm sure you've been following the hearings that we've had on this, it's still almost, it's really hard to understand how, given we're putting all the money in, as was said at the very start of the presentation here, that we don't own the asset at the end. And if anything, one of the little nuggets of things you learned what Air said last week, actually fibre stands up really well. It's very good against lightning, it's very good again in Irish wet conditions. It seems like the experience of the 340,000 houses is actually that fibre is going to hold up really well, and all the more, particularly if we're building now a new network. And what Analysis Mason are saying today, to be honest, is slightly different to what they said to us in the committee. It's hard to reconcile what they're saying in their note to the department to what they said here about the benefits of having a dual network. But given that we're creating its dual network, it seems to me, given that that fibre in real-life experience, according to Air, is standing up really well to the environment in rural Ireland, we're giving away an asset and that we're paying for. Is there anything that those University of Limerick professors said in that regard that doesn't make sense? Because it seemed to me they were very compelling in their arguments.
So, like, we again have been dealing with this intensively since 2015, and we went out and we consulted on it, and interestingly, AIR, who were before the committee last week, supported a gap-funded model. We did a project reappraisal in 2018 when we were down to one bidder. They did a very comprehensive review from the ground up as to whether or not the gap-funded model from a financial and non-financial perspective was the right way to go. The answer was yes. I think and we've covered this in our previous submission, the key piece about ensuring the effectiveness of the gap-funded model is to make sure you have the protections in place in the contract, which Fergal is talking about, the clawback provisions and provisions for future-proofing and all the rest, and you have strong governance mechanisms in place in the department to oversee it. I mean, one of the things that strikes you about the UL intervention was the way they drew comparisons with PPP projects. And when you look at the PPP sector in Ireland, it's really for the purpose of delivering a project or services traditionally provided by the public sector with assets reversing to the state. Now, we're in a space now where we're looking at how you provide services in areas that are not served by the commercial sector, but for a technology that is traditionally provided by that sector, and where the public sector has to step in and provide a subsidy. So you're kind of comparing apples and oranges to a certain extent. And I mean, I understand, Deputy, of course, that this is one of the issues that people have found quite perplexing, and we have dealt with it comprehensively in the original documents that we put forward, all the way through the analysis, when AIR dropped out and we were left with a single bidder, and we asked KPMG to talk to us about does the arrangement still stand up in a single bidder solution? If it does, then what are the additional protections we need to layer on top of that to make sure the state gets value for money and is fully protected in the investment that it makes?
Thank you. Senator Joe O'Reilly.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our guests, and thank you for your painstaking efforts to explain it. It's very, very complex. If I might make a remark in relation to my good friend, Deputy Eamon Ryan's intervention, without opening an extraneous debate, without starting a debate, I'd just remind him that his constituents benefit from a LUAS, a public bus service, and an entire infrastructure subsidised by the great taxpayers of Ireland, and it will be my contention that the people that I represent, albeit in disparate locations and wishing to be so, that they are entitled as citizens to similar.
M3,
Sorry?
M3,
Senator,
So, but anyway, we'll not go there, but it is, the people I represent would be anxious that that would be said, because they feel they have rights as citizens too. Having put that on the record, and I say that very respectfully because I have great time for Deputy Ryan, I'll move on to say that I have an intern, over from America at the moment up in the office. And it occurred to me that if he had been in last week, he's a bright lad, actually, very bright fellow, and his parents can be very proud of him, but if he had been in this room last week listening to AIR, he could only draw one conclusion if he believed everything they said. And I say this with great respect and not in a flippant way, that we had a totally incompetent public service and that we had very incompetent political people leading them, and or policy makers. And I don't believe either is the case, but I'm only saying it would be a reasonable opposite. Either AIR are right or you guys are not up to your job. I mean, one's the case, and a layperson could only look at it that way. The two things are not going. You cannot say both of you are up to it if AIR is telling the truth. But that's an observation as a taxpayer, or that if people are watching this on. I doubt if it'll have a huge audience, but those who are watching, it will occur to them. There's somebody off the wall here. Somebody's not up to what they're at. Either the AIR people of last week, in their presentation, are putting in red herrings and erroneous stuff, or you guys this week are defending the indefensible and you didn't do your job right. And now I have a view on that, and you'd be happy with my view, but I'm only saying that that's what a reasonable person looking on would say. Let me to the questions then. My first question, and it's partly answered, but it's a seriously significant question, and it's one that the people watching this will want to know about. At the moment we hear, and you did address it, but that an air connection is 170, but there is another connection charge then for each change of service, and that can lead to a big lot of money. And then there's the business if you're more than 50 metres from the pole on the air proposition. So I'd like it again to go on the record, because I think the people watching this, let's assume we have some audience, they have a right to know the answer to this. The air proposition is going to cost them a lot more as consumers, and how much more. And again, if you could put figures on that, because they need to know, and people need to know what are we talking about. As you say, apples and oranges is a good way of putting it earlier. If somebody's watching this, they need to know that this is the implication of the air bid, of the air alleged, of the air hypothetical bid of last week. Yeah, maybe if you would answer that, and then I'll try to move. I'll be as succinct as I can.
Okay, thanks, Senator. On the connections, I suppose, based on what Comreg have communicated to us, and it's in Comreg documents, and I think Eircom wouldn't disagree, the current connection model does allow the sort of multiple 170s, but it's up to 460 euros. So you can't charge somebody 4 or 5 times if you've gone over the 460. So I think it's capped at 460. I think that's the current model. On the basis that's the average,
a lot of money.
And that's only on the basis that that's the average cost. If the average cost goes up to say 560 or 760, I understand that they could then add more charges on. Now, but I think Eircom are pretty comfortable with their 460 number on the 300k, because, as I said, people have used the low-hanging fruit, but they are the least cost within the previous 750.
Would you again please elucidate for the taxpayers what the more than 50 metres from the pole involves? Okay,
so you drive along any rural road outside any village in Ireland, and the topography is generally homogeneous. What I mean by that is, you will have a percentage of homes, bungalows, one-off housing in ribbon developments that the gate is maybe 10 or 15 yards in from the road with a bit of line sight, and the house in the driveway is just there. You also have a lot of homes that are up laneways and on farms. And if they're on a farm, there'll be 4 or 5 homes in a cluster where families, rightly or wrongly, sons and daughters, have built on the family farm.
Which they have a right to.
And they've absolutely got a right to. They will, and those young families will want high-speed broadband over the next 25 years. Eircom, under its current model, does not offer the connection to those for 170 euros under the 300k. It will, of course, connect that farm if they're happy to spend whatever money it costs in addition to that. Of course they will.
And that money in addition could be how much?
Now, I'll just correct myself there, though. Within the 300k, I will correct myself that they're not currently offering to connect those premises, because we have also, and I think Minister Naughton has said it on record, there was a number of premises outside the 300k that the Department and the previous Minister Naughton, asked Eircom to connect, because it kind of made sense to connect them because they were close to the ones that they had already committed to.
Yeah, we all got representations about those.
And Eircom said, no, we're not doing those because that's not in the commitment agreement. So they've stuck pretty rigidly to the commitment agreement for their own reasons. I think mainly project management and cost. Now, that's the first element of connection costs. The second element of cost to the consumer is the monthly rentals that Eircom Wholesale will charge retailers. Now, currently, that is regulated on retail minus basis. Comreg does not have a price cap on the wholesale charge. It's basically regulated based on the level of competition in the market. But over time, and I think it's alluded to in Eircom's letter, that they assume a wholesale price increase of 2% per annum. Now, in the current bid, our bidder is saying, I'm not assuming that 2% because I don't expect urban prices to go up by 2% every year. And telecoms prices generally don't follow inflation. And I think the telecoms in Federation have presented numerous times saying telecoms prices have generally gone down the curve compared to inflation, which has gone up. So it's difficult to assume that over the next 25 years, wholesale prices in rural areas, if they're benchmarked under our model, will go up. Whereas if Eircom's in a commitment agreement that's not contracted by us, they may be free to have different prices. I'm not saying they will or intend to, but there will be nothing, there's no universal service obligation on them to have an affordable retail price.
And that could be as high as 1,000 or more.
Well, I'm talking about here, that's the connections. I'm talking about the monthly rental.
Yeah, the connections could be
the monthly rental is €30 per month on a wholesale basis. Our bidders, considering that €30, there's not much likelihood that that will increase if it's benchmarked to urban, which is the policy. The policy set out in the contract saying urban prices should be similar and comparable to urban prices for the duration of this contract for 25 years. And the bidder is sticking to that in a contract. There's no requirement on air in a commitment agreement or commercially over 25 years to keep that level of
It's very
comparison.
important that that's understood.
Now, I'm not saying Eircom would ever increase the price.
Oh no, I know, it's hypothetical.
But hypothetically, they could increase in a commercial basis. In the fibre 300k area, that fibre could increase, and Comreg would be obliged to let them increase it if that's the cost that they've incurred in terms of operating the network, repairing the network, maintaining the network, and that could result in different prices in urban areas and rural areas over time on a commercial basis if Eircom elected to have differential pricing. I'm not saying they will, but they could.
It probably goes back as well to the point that we made earlier, that our intervention was acknowledged as well in the Air letter. There is a societal and a policy issue that we need to deal with. So you set a connection cost at €100, you're far more likely to attract people to connect to the system. So a family living in the intervention area in rural Ireland, 4 or 5 kids, you get them on much earlier to high-speed broadband. They benefit from the education.
Which is great societal benefit.
Totally. You get the educational benefits, you get the remote working benefits, and if you talk to any of the companies in Dublin or in Cork, the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons, the Accentures, all of those, they are mad to get people to work from home because the pressure on office accommodation
and the cost
in
Dublin
and the cost of housing. So it makes a big difference, from a climate action perspective, makes a big difference from a social inclusion perspective, you know, with all the developments in e-health and remote monitoring of elderly people with health issues. So there's a massive range, the whole area of smart farming, there's a massive range of technologies, value-added and social inclusion things that we can deal with really, really quickly by providing this infrastructure at a reasonable connection cost and a reasonable cost to buy the products. And that's where the kind of the societal piece comes in and where the government policy is at.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Griffin, for that.
More questions?
And I think that's very clear to people and should be. Now, just very briefly to race through this, but it's an important point. On page 1 of your statement, you said there appears to be support for the following policy objectives, and you did state them, that we get to 100% of premises. Yeah. We're all very keen on that. That we get strong protection for the state and for taxpayers and all of that, and we're keen on that. That we get equal access for all commercial retailers, providers to the network, so that consumers can get the lowest costs and highest level of service and competition, etc. And that we get a future-proof network, as you alluded to earlier, and that prices should be affordable for users, which is our last discussion. Yeah. And my question to you is, did all the bidders agree with each of these 5 policy objectives during the negotiations, including
absolutely at the very outset, and that was addressed as part of the pre-qualification process back in the start of 16, I think, after the strategy was developed.
And that included air, obviously.
Yeah, and we would have consulted on that beforehand as well.
Yes.
So all of them bought into that at that point.
That speaks volumes. Now, on page 6, of Air's letter to the department, to your department, they indicate that the NBP process would have forced Air to offer better wholesale prices and access, better service levels and lower prices to the 20% of customers in the intervention area. And that would have ultimately led to better prices and access, better service levels and lower prices for all customers. They indicate that that would have had a catastrophic effect on their business. Now, it's not fair they're not here to answer, but we would have all anecdotal evidence and within our offices of a level of complaint about service there. But surely that would be hardly a bad thing that they'd be forced to deliver a better service, and that surely they're implicitly admitting that all is not as it should be now. So would you have a comment on that?
It's just a contagion issue.
I think,
Yeah, I think.
I mean, the point there, and Fergal Mulligan has dealt with it in quite some detail, Chair, I think already on the contagion issue. I mean, we had sympathy with them in terms of the contagion issue. We had sympathy with them where if they took an action within the NBP process and it had an unintended consequence outside of the NBP process that put them at a disadvantage to other commercial operators where that was not intended. We had a sympathy with that. What we had was a different view as to the risk of that, which we've just outlined earlier on how that played out.
Yeah. Okay. So, no, I want to ask you now about Air's evidence of the committee last week, where they said they could complete the process for less than $1 billion. And the letter received 3 days later indicates that the subsidy they would require would be between $500 million and $1.5 billion, and none of those figures include that. My question is this: given the cost inflation over just 3 days, can we have any confidence in the whole propositions?
Well, I think rather than commenting on the level of confidence, I think we wrote to Air.
Well, I don't mean competence.
Yeah.
Competence.
We wrote to Air to seek information so as we could clearly understand what it was that they were saying to the committee. And I think from listening to the committee and reading back on the transcript and reading the letter, it's clear to me that what Air was doing was saying, to be helpful to the committee, to say, if you just take our model in the 300k and say, what would it cost to do the same in the NBP area, this is what it would be. And when you look at the letter,
but they're apples and oranges, aren't they?
Yeah, and it recognises. I mean, the letter does recognise that the NBP is it's to meet public policy objectives, and that there will be different criteria that will flow from that. And the letter calls that out. It recognises that to its credit. And
it would be helpful if that had been put into the record last week to not create confusion for our public.
Yeah, I suppose it is a complex matter, and it points to that. But I think the key point for us is that, and we've spoken to it today, is that because of the approach that the department has taken with the NBP process, when we're dealing with numbers, we deal with the worst case scenario number. It's appropriate to call out where there could be where there could be wins and where that number could be lower and there could be clawback. But to be fair, you have to, when you're looking forward as far as you are, to call out what it might cost. And I think the point made here today is that in the model that Air has talked about, which is a commercial model of it delivering without the imposition of public money and all that comes with that, in their model they're saying 1.5 billion. In our model, the equivalent would be 2.1, but they're not like for like. They are two different projects.
Yeah. Thank you for making that clear. And very finally, and I think you did make reference to this in a reply to Deputy Dooley earlier, would you be happy to come back in writing to us, to the committee, if there's any other testimony which you wish to make to to make a comment on, issues that we subsequently come up with, or issues that occur to you that the constraints of the debate, etc., didn't allow? Because this is of such seriousness, because were it to be the case, I mean, it raises enormous questions, you know what I mean? And we just have to get this right for people and answers. Because where's the other stuff to be correct? I mean, God Almighty,
So, there's a couple of things on that, Senator, and I think it's important again to say what I said at the outset and to quote what Air said in their letter. It's not a formal offer designed to replace or supersede the current NBP process. And I think that's an important point, again, to put on the record. We were in the difficult situation, and again, I apologise to the committee because you got my opening statement late, you got the analysis Mason paper during the course of the day, and you got the aid memoir. right up until we came into the committee this evening, we were still working through some of these issues. We've done a lot of analysis since Friday evening, but we would be happy to spell out in writing some of the more
would you please, yes,
some of the more important issues like the overbuild, like the
yes,
connection
and
costs.
if insofar as you can achieve it without losing the sense of it, to put it in language that we could send it to the people that elect us and they could read it.
Absolutely, and the discussion we've had over the last couple of days is that in trying to explain this, and I don't know whether we succeeded or failed, that it has to be in terms that human beings understand.
Yes, because they are the ones who it's all about them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
And
Mr.
we
Grant.
welcome anything written that you will submit to us.
Yes.
Either from today's deliberations, or if we have future meetings and you want to contribute, we very much welcome that in writing. Deputy Stanley.
Thanks. And just at the outset, could I just ask maybe that I would just have one answer to the questions, one or two answers, because, you know, there's so many contributions, so many questions there have taken over half an hour.
In fairness, Deputy, and it is complicated, and there's a lot involved in this whole process, and we've had a number of meetings, so we needed to get a lot of clarity, and you'll have the same time here today, Deputy, as long as you need.
No, I appreciate the fact that there's another senator waiting. There's two other people waiting to get in, and there's a panel here for 2.5 hours. Just in relation to the overall project, in the last number of weeks, the revelations and some of the information that has come out, some stuff that we suspected maybe and raised with ministers in the past in relation to this broadband project. Another one has popped out today where you said, Mark, that Air held up the project for 1.5 years, doing hard bargaining over the subsidy, how much they're going to charge to allow cables to be hung on their poles. Some of us would have said that earlier on.
I don't think
you said here today.
No.
He said that 1.5 years was used. I think nearly 1.5 years.
I think it's
it'll show up in the replay of that.
I'll just let Mr. Mulligan in to clarify. I think he wants to clarify.
Can I make a clarification that no, the time frame I was referring to there was the time between discussions that were going on with Eircom and an information notice that was published by Comreg. I'm not tying the two together in terms of what happened in 2017. Bidders engaged with Eircom over a period of a couple of months in 2017 after Eircom's 300,000 was taken out. That engagement happened, and Alice Mason set out in their memo that the bidders made decisions based on the information in front of them, and they all moved on.
Okay, but I think you referred to the fact the difficulties in negotiating that price in relation to the €20 per pole.
Sorry, no, I didn't mention any difficulties.
I look at the tape tomorrow.
Do no. What?
I look forward. So if we could just move on.
But he's here, so you can't move on because he wants to clarify.
No,
sorry, he's here to clarify.
What I think the analysis Mason document is setting out, and I won't. They set out what the bidders said to us were there were difficulties in getting information on the product that was being made available, and it was in development, as my colleague here said. There was a product in development in 2017, and it was a new product. Products take a long time to develop in the wholesale telecoms world. And the information was available to Cerro and Granham Court at the time. The pricing had nothing to do with the process of 2017. I said in 2018, following the information notice from Comreg, Ireland has now benefited as a result of Eircom has now put a lower price on the pole that was available to everybody in 2017. So it was €20 in 2017 to everybody. It's slightly lower in 2018 for anyone that was still in the process. It just happened there was only one bidder left in the process, but they got a discount through the open air product set.
Okay, just in relation to the 300,000, 340,000 premises area at that Air now have within theirs. If you look at what analysis Mason said about that, they described that here to the committee as a double whammy, and they outlined what they meant by that. That first of all, that incurred a huge capital cost to the state, as the remaining bidder would have no guarantee that would be able to use air infrastructure, right? Or that there would be difficulties with access to that. And secondly, that the remaining bidder would be prohibited from generating any income within that 300,000, 340,000 area, which continues to expand. And just want to stick with this 200,000 area, or 240,000 as it now is. The letter from Mayor, which we received just about an hour before the meeting, said that specific examples of reusing the 300k learnings and infrastructure include, it says, in the access network, Open Air's rural 300k design included spare fibre to facilitate rollout beyond the boundaries of the 300,000k footprint. Air offered use of these spare fibres to the National Broadband Plan, but for reasons unclear to us, they have declined to use it, and instead they overlaid on it. This has been a big question, and it said for reasons unclear to them that it happened. And I just want to deal with this in terms of, there's a number of issues arising around this area, that it was absolutely clear, and you were there, Fergal, I think, at the press conference today. The Minister announced this in April 2017, that the minute the maps were put down in front of us, and it was a small A4 map, an A3 map as I recall it, and it's absolutely clear what was happening here, that the circles of the houses, the groups of houses and clusters and villages were being donated, and towns, by Air. And I want to put to you a straight question. And you mentioned state, you've said that Air had to be allowed to go ahead with this, and ministers have said this. But have you ever put it to the European Commission? Have you ever laid down that map in front of them and said, by allowing this to happen, you were going to banjax the process? In other words, it was going to make it more difficult, and it's absolutely clear from, I mean, it's not just the analysis Masons, what they have to say about it. The ESB for a long time had been saying this, and the ESB have made it clear more public in recent weeks. They've been saying it, that it basically blew them out of it, right? But in terms of this state aid thing, was there detailed conversations and detailed meetings with the European Commission to say, if we allow this to happen, there's 840,000 premises to be serviced here. If we allow this to happen, this is donutting the villages, it's donutting the clusters of houses. It makes it next to impossible. Apart from more costly, more complex, I mean, look at the amount of hours and discussions. I mean, you can only imagine what the 80 people working on this have been trying to do to try and work through all of this complex web, or some people would say a mess. So that's the question to put to you. Has that happened?
Yes, we had detailed discussions with the European Commission, and yes, we showed them the maps of the donut.
And did they come back to you and say to you that you have to allow this to go ahead, even though they're going to banjax the process for the other 540,000 premises and households and farms?
They said, under state aid rules, you're required to remove those premises if a commercial operator is covering the majority of those premises in those given areas, which was the 300k area. You had no choice as a member state, regardless of the impact on subsidy, to remove those from the map.
And did they supply documentation to you saying that?
Did they supply documentation? Apart from, we did have several meetings. We travelled to Brussels a couple of times, so I can't remember in terms of any, but they were very clear in their meetings.
But that's
unambiguous. They were unambiguous.
I put this to you. That's the same as saying that the government and the Transport Infrastructure Ireland want to build a motorway from Limerick to Cork, and some private entity says we will build 20 kilometres of that, right? And they go in and build it, but then they say, hey, hold on now a second. For you to build out either side of this, you're not going through here. You know, in other words, they hold the ring, and that's what Air has done here. I mean, the reply, I would find it hard to accept that if the complexities of this were explained to the European Commission, right? And I've read some of their rulings in relation to state aid and broadband, right? There have been judgments in this regard, and there have been pronouncements around them, that in that case, that this completely, from the ESB's point of view, and the body hired by your department, you know, from what analysis Mason said about it, this completely blew this process to pieces. You know, I mean, I'm not an expert in it, and a lot of other people are not, lay people. So I mean, we have to go by what you tell us. But it's absolutely clear on the day of that announcement, as I recall it in April 17, that this process was in huge difficulty once this happened, because it was going to make it more expensive, more difficult, there was the question of you have to go in now and lease poles. You have to tie around with. Do you use the fibre that's laid already by Air, or do you overlay that and put in a parallel system along with it? I would like to see written confirmation from the European Commission that the European Commission, having looked at the proposal to donut every town, village and cluster of houses in this state, that was okay to go in and do that, and that wasn't going to damage this process, and that they were 100% sure. I would like to see that clarified with the European Commission.
I'll give you a summary.
Because this hasn't. Yeah. We're in a situation here. The summary is this, yeah. Mr. Mulligan. The summary is this: is that no matter which way this is turned or twisted, yeah. This is the major issue that derailed this process and left us with one bidder in it, with the fallacy that we're involved in a competitive process. There is no competitive process. There can never be a competitive process if there's only one team playing on the pitch. There can't be.
I'll let Mr. Mulligan in. Do you want to come in on that?
Just briefly. Around the European Commission rules, the document here in front of me, as I said, it's a legal document in the Commission. It's the state aid guidelines, and as I said, the state aid guidelines will be, I suppose, thrown to us all the time in terms of this paragraph and that paragraph, where, as I said, the DG Comp case team were unambiguous in terms of their view of a commercial investment. We have a criteria for commercial investment of whether we have to accept it or not, and on technical, commercial and a commitment agreement. And Air came forward with all of those. As we said, we had a difficult and a very good engagement on the commitment agreement, which landed in April 2017. And when the commitment agreement was signed, we had no option. We consulted Comreg also, who have a role under stated guidelines to be consulted on the map. And again, member states, and to be honest, Deputy, this is not unique. This has not happened just to us in Ireland. It has happened across Europe, where you think you have one intervention and the goalposts shift. It happened in the UK and many local areas there. It's happening in France, Italy. That's the nature of what we're in here. Commercial operators can make decisions any given week, and we have to deal with them. We're still dealing with them as we speak. That commercial operators may make announcements or put out press releases, but ultimately went through a rigorous process with Aircom. We got what we believe was a very robust commitment agreement under the circumstances where we could not avoid removing those from the intervention area. And in April 2017, when I was there at the press conference, we were fully aware of the likely impact on the process would make it more difficult. I think ESB were here last week.
But the Minister told me it wouldn't.
No, difficult I meant. At the time we weren't fully aware. We didn't believe it was going to have a detrimental impact on subsidy, and I'm not saying it did. There was many other aspects of the bidding process for bidders that resulted in the subsidy going up, not just the 300k. But what ESB did say is that bidders, including Air itself, had to redesign their network. Now that took months to do, because they'd already spent a year designing the network for the 757,000. So there's no doubt that removal complicated the process, which was complicated already.
Can you just move on? But the state aid rules is that if a private entity is going to invest in it within the next 2 years, then the state can. I understand that, right? But what the issue here is that where a private entity was allowed to go in and, if you like, occupy a space that made it absolutely impossible, next to impossible, to design a contract or get value for money or put in place a viable project to roll out this and to maintain it and run it over 25 years. That's the point I'm making. And if there's documentation around the department somewhere saying that you contested this, that the department contested this and the government contested this with the European Commission, I'd say myself and a lot of other people would like to see it. You just move on for a second. Just in relation to...
Did you want to say and I don't know whether you were in the committee when we spoke about this, but I think there's some sort of mitigation that Analysis Mason have provided to the committee around how the bidder is managing the challenge of getting through or traversing the 300k.
Important to bring it back now to the tender that we have received and the decision that Grattan McCourt have made to rather than use the active product that Air are using to connect to their fibre, to actually use just the poles and ducts. And really, they're coming, the bidders' network design starts in the mans. It has to traverse the 300k area before it gets to the intervention area. The fact that starting in the Mans means that it's not getting the same cost savings of reusing the fibre that Air would get if they were to use the same design or reuse that fibre. So the Grant McCourt, and we went into in-depth analysis with them on the benefit or otherwise of reusing that fibre on the 300k. They demonstrated to us that they didn't achieve the same cost savings from their design by reusing that fibre, and it actually was cheaper for them to deploy their own fibre and rent just the poles and ducts.
Well,
so their design decision.
The next effect now is that we're going to have two systems running through this 340k area. We're going to have two systems.
Two cables.
One of them not plugged into anything all along, that no one's plugged into all along the way, just overlaying it, and the one that's active within that area, which is Air. That's the net effect of this, of the way we've gone with this. Just in relation to the cost of connections.
Deputy, could I add just one other aspect to that?
Of course.
And I did mention this earlier. It doesn't mean that Grattan McCourt or the MBI company now cannot use that fibre going forward. They still have that as an option to pursue when they get into a low-level design, and they could pursue that fibre as an option in certain circumstances where it makes sense for them, where that product can still satisfy the requirements on future proofing and capacity. So it's not off the table as such. It's something that the MBI company now could pursue once they get to the low level design, and they are obligated to come to the department and demonstrate that after low level design that they're pursuing the most efficient solution.
Okay. Just in relation to the Air's offer or Air's proposal, they're saying it wasn't an offer. What they said here last week, but they have put it out there now that they can do it for a subsidy of between £500 million and £1.5 billion. And they said in their letter that we note that under the NDP plan, where the cost of connecting a customer is more than 5,000, the customer will be asked to make a contribution. Now we know that from the documentation supplied by ourselves to us in recent weeks here. And they went on to say that, where Air doesn't have an existing infrastructure, Air will operate a similar policy within the 300k area, which applies to 1 or 2% of connections, and we believe that is likely to cost less to the end customer than the NDP, unquote. So what we're referring to the areas is where there isn't, for example, Fergal referred to as your own house, where you don't have, and you're right, there's a lot of newer houses wouldn't have copper going to them because they're using a mobile, and I can see that in my own area. But what they're saying here clearly is that they can provide a connection to those ones called the greenfield sites, where there isn't already poles or ducting or anything like that. They can do it for every bit as cost effective as was envisaged under the National Broadband Plan. Is that not the case?
Physically, I don't understand. A pole is a pole. If NBI has to put in poles into a house or Aircom, the cost shouldn't be any different. And the cost won't be any different. And if the cost is the cost...
The cost to the customer.
Sorry, the cost to the customer under Aircoms is completely dependent on the cost of connecting. So they're connecting people within 50 metres for €170 in the 300k. There may be some premises beyond 50 metres, but we don't believe there's too many, because that's what the quit agreement requires. They're very specific in the negotiations with us. We are not going beyond 50 metres. And even if there's, and I know where I come from, there's 2 or 3 houses in the road and the farmhouse is a few hundred metres behind it. They're doing the 2 on the road. They're not doing the farm, even if all 3 made an order. But you can't, the third house at the back cannot make an order on the Aircom to 300k. NBI has to come back and hoover that up later on if that third house makes a connection.
But in the case of NBI, where the cost goes over 5,000, the customer has to pay. Yeah.
Now again, we think that we expect that to be very negligible.
Okay.
Yeah.
It won't be negligible in a lot of cases.
In the context of...
There's a number of poles to be run across fields, it won't be negligible. I'm just saying as a matter of fact.
We've modelled every premise in the country and we don't see many premises.
We suggested in the Air intervention as well that NBI will be gold plating connections. That won't be the case. We'll reuse existing infrastructure and the most cost effective means of connecting a household. There's no such thing as running new duct or anything like that, as has been indicated in the Air evidence.
could I just ask in relation to the overall project that the National Development Framework Agency, that's supposed to normally oversees projects over 20 million. And in this case, we're looking at something, you know, in the region of 2.75 billion to 3 billion. What happened here? Why wasn't the National Development Framework Agency involved in this, in overseeing and this contract? They were asked to come before the committee. They didn't come. They supplied a statement, and they said that they had, and I quote, very limited role in the National Broadband Plan, and that had no, quote again, no involvement of any description since 2018, unquote. Why is that?
Just for clarification, we invited the NDFA, but we couldn't actually hear them the day that afternoon, just for clarification.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that just from their point of view, and they did send us a written submission as requested from the committee, so it wasn't that they didn't come, we actually couldn't see them that afternoon. Just to clarify that.
Given the fact that there was to and fro with the Department of Finance, and we know that senior people in the Department of Finance is a very different position to yourselves on it, we've had it before the committee here to explain that since. Given the fact that that was going on, would it not have been prudent and sensible maybe for the National Development Framework Agency to be more directly involved in this, overseeing this project?
Yeah, sorry, Deputy, I'll take that. I mean, the National Development Finance Agency, we got to know them very well over 3 years because of their involvement. So they were involved in 2016, 17 and 18. They weren't involved since 2018 because the procurement process and the evaluation which they were involved in finished when the evaluation was finished last October, November, I think it was 2018. Obviously we're now in 2019, but the evaluation of the bid. So they came on the pitch in discussions with myself and Kieran's predecessor in 2015 when we did discuss their role in the NBP process. That was in 2015, 4 years ago, because clearly they have a role, as you say, on the legislation for any projects over 20 million. And it was agreed at that time what their terms of reference would be for the NBP. Now, we set out our stall about what the NBP process was. We had hired at that time KPMG to be our commercial finance advisors as well as other advisors. We had PwC on CBA and we had Niles Mason on technical and Mason Hayes on legal. And it was the view of NDFA that, and they're very busy with roads and schools, etc. at the time, that there would be a duplication of resources for them to take on the entire corporate finance role within the process when KPMG had just been hired to do the same work and a full team of KPMG people that NDFA would use for roads and schools as well. So, but they were involved along the journey of the procurement process. The senior member.
So when did their role
end?
More or less finish?
It ended after we had got to the end of the evaluation of the bid.
What time? When was that? What year?
I think it was November. When do we finish the final? November of 2018.
November 18.
Now, what that meant was we received the bid in September 2018, as you know, and then our teams and NDFA were in the review process of the evaluation of the team. They weren't on evaluation teams, but they were on what we call an evaluation review panel and on the procurement board. They were represented on those two stages of our governance of the tender process. And over the course of September, October, November, they were involved in many meetings to review the tender in terms of whether it qualified through the questions that we've set out in the tender documents, and only the questions that related to finance and the commercial finance aspect of the bid, not technical, not legal or anything else, only within the confines of their remit as a financial advisor to the state. But we had senior people involved in NDFA. I wouldn't underestimate that involvement, but they were very much involved.
Well, they did. They said it had a very limited role. And you've confirmed that there's no involvement of any description since 2018. Just in relation to the overall project, and you know the public looking at it, and people like ourselves looking at it, that you know it's fairly clear. There's a couple of things fairly clear about it. One is that the 240,000 that have been, if you like, cherry picked by Air, and that they're servicing commercially. That created huge problems, and that was. We've had that discussion around that. That created a lot of difficulties in terms of the complexities and the cost and logistical problems in relation to the which Patrick would have dealt with and technical stuff around the rest of the project, the other 500,000. And then the ESB and Air walked away after that, and both of them confirmed that that's why after that they basically left the process after that. And then there's the cost of, and this is the one that the public are really exercised about, that we're going to take 1 billion, almost 1 billion of your money, Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer, and we're going to give it to this entity over here, right, that's backed by American investors. Nothing against Americans, it just happens to be. And then we're going to hand, that American investor is then going to hand this, to another private entity called Air, so as they can hang the cables to get the broadband to the people's houses that people will then pay for. And isn't that the crux of this issue? Isn't that, those two factors, the 340,000 being taken out of the 840,000, and the fact that there has to be a subsidy paid to the private investment entity to hand to another entity, another private company, which we did own, by the way, until it's privatised, which is that's the root of all this problem. It's unfortunate that that we don't have the infrastructure still in state ownership, because it would save an awful lot of hassle for everyone. But isn't that the crux of what has driven up the price of this project, that has driven it out to the roof?
Just the short answer, I won't go back over the 340 because I think we've dealt with that extensively. But in terms of, there has been a good deal of focus around, because it's a figure of almost €1 billion, 900 and something million euro, that we have, it's in the model that would be paid to Air for rental of poles over 25 years. The reality is that that is based on the regulated product, the regulated pricing that's in place by Comreg. So what that is it's an estimate of what the cost of operating and maintaining that network over 25 years would be. So it costs you to build a network, and then it costs you to maintain that network, and you must pay those costs. If the state built its own network, the state would have to invest similar type sums to maintain that network over 25 years. Now we have included in, and it's included in our tender, what the cost today that Comreg says is required to pay to maintain those poles is, and Comreg will regulate that going forward for so long as they see that is necessary. But that's a real cost. That's not, that's not paying somebody, giving them a return on earlier investment. It's related to real costs of maintaining a network over that period.
The other point I'd make, and is going back to the state aid rules, the criticality of reusing existing infrastructure to the greatest extent possible. And the reality is, if we ended up building a new network, and we've already received some criticism about the fact that we've had to traverse the Air 300K, but if we had to build a new network in the intervention area, the cost to the taxpayer would be multiples of what is on the table at the moment. I suppose the other important thing to say is, Air have worked very closely with MBI over the last while to try and come to an arrangement which works commercially for them and for MBI in terms of access to their infrastructure. They are involved in an access infrastructure agreement. They will be working on a Make Ready programme, which is absolutely critical to the rollout of this contract when it gets underway. So Air is a really, really important player in all of this, and that's quite understandable because we need access to their infrastructure, both poles and ducts. And we circulated some figures. I think 90% of the Air pole network is used, and probably a higher percentage of the Air duct network. So I mean, it's a critical part of the project overall. So, like in terms of the duct network, 338 cables a new duct and 14,000 of duct rented from Air, 90,000 new poles and 1.2 million poles rented from Air. So they are a major part of the equation, and that's inevitable when you go back to the state aid rules, which makes a big play about reuse of infrastructure, and it ultimately ends up a cheaper way to do the contract.
Senator Lombard.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief.
First of all, thank the Department for their presentation. I think it's been very informative this afternoon. I want to comment in a way on my colleague VideoParliament, Senator Joe O'Reilly. He made a comment about rural Ireland, and he was rebuking another colleague of mine regarding the view about the sparse population. And it kind of brought into question why we're doing all this. I think there was a statement made by the General Secretary regarding what this means for rural Ireland, things like smart farming, smart education, e-health was mentioned, the opportunity to work from home and the digital companies we have, whether in Cork or wherever. Were all those items taken into consideration by the Department of Finance deeper when they made their analysis of the actual project itself? Issues such as smart farming, smart carbon footprint, climate change, all those key issues for society going forward.
I think the way the public spending code is currently structured, you're quite limited in terms of what are the things you factor in when you're doing a cost-benefit analysis. We, even allowing for the more limited approach taken in the cost-benefit analysis, which we had to do, the cost-benefit, and I think you heard this in PwC, but remained consistently positive. We made the point all along in the process that we're talking now about providing an infrastructure. We know some of the things that it will provide advantages to, and the things that you have mentioned are some of them. But we're actually providing an infrastructure to deal with things that haven't even been conceived now. Because when you look at the evolution of technology over the last 10 years, 10 years ago there were no smartphones. You see everything that's been done now by virtue of a smartphone. You see the sort of high-tech technologies that are being produced. And you'll even see today, for example, that ESB have talked about the rollout of their first tranche of smart meters in Cork over the next couple of years. You need high-speed broadband and technology to make sure that consumers reap the benefits of that in terms of time of use tariffs, better use of electricity in the home, the whole climate change agenda and all the rest. But they're sort of a qualitative suite of benefits that you're not allowed to factor in or crunch in the numbers. But to me, they're as important, if not more important, than the things you can put a figure on. And that was the point that we consistently made with our colleagues in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. We were very clear on that in the submission of the Memorandum for Government. And I mean, some of the things that this technology will do have not even been invented. I think some of the figures we saw, for example, there'll be 50,000 devices connected to the Internet of Things by 2020, or 50 billion devices connected to the Internet of Things by 2020. I mean, that's colossal. You're talking about smarter homes, smarter offices, down the road, autonomous driving and all the rest. But there's huge potential, and we haven't fully conceived what that potential is. But the provision of this technology, fibre technology, where you've unlimited download speeds and so on, I think will be very, very important. The other point that Fergal has reminded me of, I mean, we're looking at a rollout that by the end of year 3 we will have over 200,000 homes connected to past, and a large chunk of that connected in the intervention area. But we've also made provision in the contract for broadband connection points. So this is the sort of stuff that we've seen publicised in the Aran Islands, where people can come together, get a high-speed connection, have a proper office set up, be able to work from there well in advance of actually getting the connection to their own home. That creates a very effective working community within the locality where they can work. And if you look at Apple in Cork, I mean, I think Apple, a large number of people work from home where they can.
100%, yeah.
and more of that will happen. And we know from speaking to the large technology companies that they are absolutely up for this. And the whole way, the future of work, the future of jobs is going to change dramatically. And you'll have teams, you'll have individuals working from home, but working on a team basis, cloud computer services, collaborative conferences, and so on and so forth. So it's all there, and it's all there to be had, and it's a big prize if we can get this right.
Okay. Can I ask about the USO proposal that we've spoken about today in detail? AIR have been mentioned in that space several times today. Are AIR happy with the current USO model that's been worked on the copper line itself, or have any proposals that actually change that?
I think, suppose it's really is an area which is more appropriate, Senator, to Comrade, but I suppose it's there in the public domain that there would be a challenge there in terms of the cost that and a dispute between AIR and Comric as to whether they should be compensated for the cost or not. But that's a matter very much for the regulator.
Okay. Can I ask about the red line issues? And you've gone over some of them. One of the red line issues that I've read is the bond or the security or the fixed money that's pertaining to the actual bid itself. There's been an awful lot of speculation and talk about and comment regarding the $220 million, the guaranteed money that was going to be put up front by the preferred bidder. Were AIR happy to engage in that process, put that sum of money or another sum of money on the table in a guarantee going forward?
To be fair to AIR, there was a lot of discussion around that, and at the time of them leaving, it was still under discussion. It's fair to say also, though, that it hadn't been resolved, but there was a requirement in our tender documentation from anyone that bid that while the state was making a guarantee, and of course anybody entering the process was looking for that state guarantee, whether it was 400 million or 4 billion, I mean, the state was putting up, the government was committing to that through a government decision. And we said, well, we would want a commensurate guarantee from the private sector, that there was no doubt about it that if we entered into a contract, and whether you're committing €100 or 100 million euros or a billion, that there's no doubt but you have the money and will have the money to call upon when it's required. And there's no way in the world that a board, the current board of any commercial company or a future board, could change their mind, because things change over time commercially. So that was a key requests of ours in the tender documentation, that we got the necessary financial assurance from everybody. We treated everybody equally, so we couldn't deviate for any particular bidder for any particular circumstances. And as I said, that was a discussion that was ongoing at the time. Aircom presented it as a red flag issue in January 2018. Again, whether that would have been resolved throughout the rest of the dialogue process, I suppose we'll never know now.
Okay, and regarding the actual clawback then, there was issues regarding clawback in the contract. What was the proposed clawback under the underperformance kind of issues itself? And were AIR happy with that clawback, or what was the issue of AIR regarding that actual clawback?
Yeah, okay. Again, as I said earlier on, and I read out the state aid guidelines, where the state aid guidelines require member states to have clawback. The state aid guidelines say that it's up to member state to negotiate the best possible clawback.
Well, the internet works here.
We have broadband, Wi-Fi. Yeah.
So the state aid,
It's the wrong one.
the state aid guidelines don't prescribe what percentage it is. So again, you have a percentage of clawback for the build, you have a percentage of clawback for excess profits if everything goes wonderfully well, and you have an excess profits for the value of a business at the end of it, in particular if it's a gap-funded model. That can range from 0 to 100% on any of those three categories, and that's where you're negotiating the best possible outcome for the state while keeping incentives on the bidder. Now, if you had in the perfect world, as people would like to have it, you had multiple bidders and you had a perfect competition, which is in a telecom sector like this virtually impossible to get perfect competition, given the incumbencies and the different technologies and infrastructures available. In a perfect competition environment, you're less risky of bidders coming in with a prudent view on costs or a prudent view on likely profits. in a less competitive environment or a risky environment, more like to put it, in a contract like this for 25 years, no matter what the competition in the process, all bidders are likely to put a very conservative view on the world. That's exactly what we found with the 3 bidders we had at the table, that nobody was running to make the cheapest possible offer, because the consequence of doing that later on, of going bankrupt, were fairly significant. So you're dealing with 3 bidders that were taking a very realistic view of the world. But that realistic view of the world was prices might go up. It's like the Baz Luhrmann song, you can guarantee certain things, but you can nearly always guarantee prices will go up and materials will go up and whatever that verse is. So therefore you need to, there's no point in predicting prices won't go up and get burned. But also we didn't want to deal with operators that were saying, well, prices will go up by 10% every year, and if they do, you need to give me all this money. We'll say, well, we may give you some money, but if it doesn't happen and it's a 2% increase every year, we'll claw that back. In the current situation, with most of the costs for build, we claw back 100% currently. That's what we got to after Eircom left, when Mark mentioned the recommendation was to go forward with a much, much more improved and robust contract and governance model, because you're in a single bidder situation. Before Eircom left, we did not have 100% clawback. We had 50% clawback on the majority of the build costs. So it was a significant shift from having 2 to 3 bidders in the process to having 1 on the main risk cost areas, where we now only pay what it costs. Previously, the private sector may have, now it wasn't fully negotiated, but the commercial guys would have been looking for 50% of the savings that might have been realised, which would have been a significant bonus to them if they realised savings. On the excess profits, from memory, the excess profits was a lot less than what we have now, which is 60%. It was 50% or below. So again, we negotiated that up rather than down, which would have been probably, in a competitive environment, negotiated down by competitors, the more risk they would have saw with the project and the more risk of construction and demand. And then in terminal value, I think we have now currently 40%. We had a lot less before. I can't remember the percentage. It may not have been much, but we got a much better outcome in a single bidder situation on the clawbacks to the state, to protect ourselves from the single bidder situation, which may take a more conservative view on costs and demand. But that's exactly what the state aid guideline paragraph sets out, where the member state, in that environment where there's asymmetric information between the authority and the bidder, you put in protections to say via clawback. And it happens all over Europe. As I said before, BDUK have clawed back 800, 700 million already from UK and certain projects there from BT, where they would have predicted probably maybe certain scenarios that were more risky than maybe turned out to be the case. But again, in a project of this scale, as ESB said, and the scale of risk of construction, and a 7-year period where we're in an environment where a lot of housing is taking place, a lot of construction projects are taking place, subcontractors are out the door. Where will prices go? Nobody knows, so it's hard to predict that into a model. They've predicted where it might go. We've got contingency in there if it goes worse, but we've got a 100% clawback if it goes better.
Okay.
And that's a significant part of the governance model that Mark alluded to. That 10 million a year that we may or may not spend on governance, we expect will be more than covered by savings.
And that 10 million that you talk about, is that the special purpose vehicle that you're talking about?
No, Senator.
Where does that fit in then?
The special purpose vehicle is National Broadband Ireland. That's what it's called now. It would have been called MBPCO hypothetically, but since the final tender come in, National Broadband Ireland, I suppose, has been incorporated. It's a special purpose vehicle incorporated in Ireland, tax resident in Ireland, and we'll have a board that's answerable to the Minister, with the Minister's appointee and the senior management. I suppose the up to 10 million or whatever number ends up being the cost of governance will reside within the department. You're probably looking at some of the people that will be that unit, I suppose, that governs for a period of time, and there may or may not be an agency that does something in the future.
And regarding the actual, this entire debate, we've heard a lot about the 300,000 people that have been moved over the last few years. We've had conflicting evidence here, and I hope I'm not wronging anyone, between both AIR and the EXB regarding that 300,000 and where that sat in with the actual process itself. Was that 300,000, was that the game changer regarding the actual process?
Well, I'll let Pat talk to the technical bit. As I said, what it did, it absolutely made it difficult for everyone in the process, because in April 2017, which was probably.
Now, Air said it made no impact on the process or on the actual thing.
I think they may have been referring to their view of the world on the subsidy. I think everybody would agree that they had concluded a fairly arduous commitment agreement negotiation with us for 6 months, 9 months, as I said. It started when the first draft of the contract commitment agreement was drafted up. That was a difficult process. We put in significant onerous requirements on them, which in the main we understand they've met in terms of that passing and connecting milestone. They're nearly there. So I don't think Eircom would say that that didn't add complexity to the process of procurement, because they also has a bid team, and they had a separate bid team to their commercial team. Their bid team, I'm sure, would admit that having to remove the 300,000, having to redo their network design, having to redo the commercial model, having to renegotiate the legal contract, added complexity to their process dealing with us and us dealing with them. The same applied for the Sorrow bidders, the same was applied for Granham Accord. So from that perspective, all three bidders were in the same position. I suppose the impact on what Deputy Stanley arrived at earlier on, did it impact on cost, did it impact on subsidy, and I suppose it was a mixture of many different things that had an impact on where we are now. The subsidy, clearly there's less revenue in the model, so clearly bidders would, like ESB would say, there was a lot less revenue, so it was less commercial. So one bidder said they believed it had a pretty significant impact on their ability to bid. But again, they were planning to use their own network, so they might see the world differently to Eircom, who was using their network. And then ENET were planning to use the Eircom network or the MANS network or a combination of both. So you had three different bidders with three different views of the world in terms of the commercial impact that 300k had. But I think ESB were clear last week that it had a significantly detrimental impact to their commercial view of the world for MVP. But there may be other aspects that they considered as well.
Can I ask about the actual issue? I was going to issue now. What was it again? The issue regarding the actual, where do you think this is going to go regarding the actual tendering? If we were, God forbid, to go down the re-tendering model, we've had testimony from KWP, your advisors, very early on, saying it could take 3 to 5 years to start this process again, go through the entire framework and working through it. If within, look, let's say within tomorrow morning we are to start this process again, could you go through where you believe and how long it would take us to actually go through that process?
Well, I'll ask Patrick, because actually we did a lot of work on this when looking at the contingency options in late 2018 and early 2019, and we did a whole suite of contingency options, and the instruction I gave to the guys was that they needed to be as aggressive as they possibly could in terms of a new procurement process if, for whatever reason, the government decided to embark on such a process. And Patrick did a huge amount of work on this, looking at various models and various options, and I think we came in somewhere around 37 months using a very aggressive timeline. But you might break that down, Patrick, in as to what the component elements of that were.
I suppose we, through the contingency options exercise we did, we spent a lot of time to develop out how long it would take if you did pursue a new procurement process. This first step, and it was agreed in that exercise that the first step would be to set up a broadband agency or a special purpose vehicle within the state that would be tasked with the mandate to deliver broadband. From there, that agency would then be tasked with developing a strategy. And just by way of comparison, this is a similar exercise that we undertook starting in 2014, and we brought together an international panel of experts. We used Comreg. We obviously took in PwC, KPMG, Analysis Mason, and Mason's Curran as advisors. And we conducted a series of public consultations to develop that strategy, taking into account state aid guidelines and views of the industry that came back. That took 20 months in our process. So, just by way of comparison, Mark, as he just alluded to, said we don't have 20 months to launch a new procurement process, so we need to do it a lot faster. So we through parallel working, etc., we concluded that we could do that, including then developing a new CBA, which is required under the Public Spending Code, and do a new project reappraisal and prepare the procurement documentation. We expected we could do that in 16 months to launch, just to get to the start of a new procurement process. From there, then the procurement itself, if you go through a pre-qualification of 6 months, dialogue and bilateral engagement with bidders, and further 6 months, again, in our process today, it has taken us 26 months to do that, and to evaluate the final tender 3 months, and to come to a preferred bidder selection, which again would take another 3 months. Again, in our process to date, that has taken 8 months, that just final bit. So just taking an extremely optimistic view on the procurement, we believe it will take 18 months to conclude a procurement process. So taking the two of those together, and finally taking the state aid approval process into account and contract close, it would take at least 37 months to do a new procurement process start to beginning, and that is a very optimistic view with a fair wind. Yeah.
Chair, could I ask then, if you were to go down the line of pausing the contract or even cancelling it, what implication would that have?
I suppose the first thing I say to you is, what would be the basis for doing that? Because it's very clear. Well, first of all, Air withdrew. It's very clear from what they have said, both in the evidence to the committee and in the letter they submitted to the department and to the committee, you are not to consider this as a proposal. This is a hypothetical assessment of what you could do if a whole range of different conditions applied. So I see no reason whatsoever to, quite frankly, even discuss that. Second point is, and we've said it in our document, you go back to scratch. You have to go back to the initiation of a public procurement process. We've got legal advice on that. We actually got legal advice on that when the issue was mooted, that perhaps we could assign it to ESB, a commercial semi-state. The legal advice was unambiguous. My interpretation is that if you start talking about a dominant player in the market, that legal advice becomes even more stronger, because you have an economic undertaking who has a dominant position in the telecoms market. So you cannot go back in and negotiate based on something that's on the table. We have concluded a process which we believe is very robust. It has arrived at an outcome. We have a preferred bidder appointed. We have a suite of protections in place which we believe would be very, very effective. I didn't get a chance to say it when Deputy Stanley was in there, but he said, there's no competition. We've said it before, the fact that you only have a single bidder in these sorts of competitions is not unusual. It was the same in the UK. And the critical thing then is, how do you stitch in the protections for the state and for the taxpayer? We believe we have done that. We have a preferred bidder appointed, and we are in a process. So, I suppose my answer to your question, Deputy, is, why would we move from what we are doing to something which the company itself has said, this is not an offer. This is an assessment of giving you something under a different process and using certain hypothetical assumptions as to how you might do it. You could end up in this sort of a debt spiral, if I could call it that you halt or pause a procurement, you go back out to the market. Who do you get to bid? I mean, people have come forward in good faith over the last number of years and involved themselves in a process. I'm not certain that you get a field of bidders. There will be a risk, I think, to the process that a decision has been made that, someone in the process has been in some way given a status that would leave the outcome of that process open to challenge. And we've no guarantee that if you went out to a process, and again looking at the evidence of error, that they would necessarily come back in. They may come back in on those terms, but we are bound by state aid rules and normal contract law, which says we can't offer you something on those terms.
Final question.
Very final question.
Very briefly. 3rd of July. When do you believe, if we were to move ahead with this process that's in front of us today, when do you believe this actual, we'll have, as they'd say, feet on the road, polls going up, broadband being delivered?
So we're working very hard on the contract laws and the financials and all of that. I mean, we're trying very, very hard to be in a position where we would be in a position to close out on the contract in the next few months. I can't give you a definitive date. I mean, we're really pushing the boat out, because I mean, no more than yourself, Deputy, who has constituents that are kicking down the door to get broadband in rural Ireland. We want to deliver this. We believe it's the right thing to do, and we believe it can make a fundamental difference. And we believe, notwithstanding the criticism that we've received about the robustness of the process, lack of competition and all of that, we do believe we have a very robust outcome from all the work we've done over the last few years.
Deputy Barry Cowan.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin, you say your job and your duty to ensure there's value for money and the taxpayers' money is protected, and I wouldn't expect anything less. We too are elected to ensure the same thing, amongst others. The difference being we'd be thrown out of our job if we don't abide by it. Taxpayer, as has been alluded to by others, is aware that you and the government are moving towards finalising this contract to employ what to many is seen as an unknown entity with no experience or history of such provision, such a product in this area, with an exposure to the taxpayer of €2.9 billion. And, it's along the lines of what Senator O'Reilly said. Meanwhile, Air say now, definitively, that they can do the same thing, that is, provide broadband to every home with an exposure to the taxpayer of €1 billion. And that's now based, that's inclusive, I might add, as was questioned earlier, of VAT and contingency, and is an informed estimate because of the experience they've since had in relation to the 300,000 extra that was originally intended to be in the National Broadband Plan. Now, in response to that contention, you and your colleagues say that there are some rules that have to be adhered to, particularly in relation to the state aid rules. But that, as we now know, is contested by reputable opinion. It would appear that there's nothing definitively in writing from the Commission to back up your contention. And you also say that there are issues surrounding governance and oversight. And as Timmy Dooley said earlier, it would appear to me, and I'm not a member of this committee, but based on the responsibility I have for my party, I'm speaking in relation to public expenditure. And as he said, it would appear that you're spending €2 billion to protect €1 billion. Now, you also, in response to the last questioner, he asked, what would happen if the whole process was paused at this stage. You said, what's the basis? You say, Air withdrew from the process. You say that their contention and the information that they've given to you and to the committee is not to be considered as a proposal. no reason. It would appear that you're simply carrying on regardless. That you have legal advice that contravenes what they contend, or they state, or they insist could be the case. So, is it that you're just doing us a favour by entertaining us in this process, despite the best intentions of those who called for this process? And I have just some specific questions, if I may, on foot of that. This didn't just become a story recently when AIR submitted details to the committee in relation to them being in a position to provide the same solution for 1 billion rather than 3 billion. They wrote to the department back in January 18. Can you confirm that? And while they mightn't have stated they could do it their way, but give the customer what it wanted, or the public what it wanted, or the taxpayer what it wanted for 1 billion, but they said, I believe, that they could do it at a fraction of the cost. What consultation or correspondence or took place with them since you received that letter? No, and I have a few other questions, and it's just one of which, because it would appear to me that I had to listen to, as is their duty, the Minister and the Taoiseach and the Government tell us that they looked at every alternative, every other option. They went over them and under them and considered them and reconsidered them, but that they were left with no option to proceed along the course that we know what it is now. And meanwhile, this letter was sitting on somebody's desk since January 18, and I have no correspondence, or I have no information to tell me that this was investigated to the nth degree then, or it was checked and rechecked and considered and reconsidered based on what was contained in that letter. Secondly, by conferring preferred bidder status to GMC, what obligation or cost does the state incur in the event of a contract not being finalised or signed? I asked the Minister that some weeks ago at our own Budget Oversight Committee, and he couldn't answer it, and he said he'd get back to me, and that was about a month or 6 weeks ago. I haven't got an answer yet, so I put it in writing in the meantime, because I think it's important and the public need to know that if there was a breakdown in the negotiations in relation to the provision of a contract with the preferred bidder, what legal status is given to the bidder and what cost is associated with that. And finally, and that's against the background of the 200 million that they're putting in, and people say, the wholesale contract, allows a recoup, but it also, if these go to the wall, the taxpayer picks up the charge, picks up the cost, end of story. It might be the case with somebody else, a reputable firm like AIR, but it's definitely the case in this instance. Do you think, all joking aside, all consideration of the process that you're hell-bent on implementing at a cost of 2 billion to save 1 billion, if it were such that that AIR said we can deliver this to every home for 1 billion, do you accept their good faith? Do you believe that they could do it their way for 1 billion?
So, just to go back to your earlier point, Deputy, our job is not just to entertain you. Our job is to provide information to the committee as part of the hearings, and that is what we have sought to do. And we have sought to do it in good faith, and we have spent a number of hours back on the 22nd of May and more hours this evening going through the whole basis for why the contract was constructed in the way it is. This isn't something that we dreamed up. It's not a figment of our imagination. There is a kind of a contention that a complex or a process that we have put in place to protect taxpayers' money has in some way driven the cost of delivering this service from 1 billion to 3 billion. Now, again, as we had said earlier in the process, when you try to compare like for like, you're talking about 1.55 billion as against 2.1 billion in the mid-case scenario. I have a note here that something was contested by reputable opinion, but I'm not sure what it is you're talking about.
Advice in relation to the state rules.
But you were talking about the 340k and the 300k and whether or not we were obliged to apply state aid rules and allow them go into the intervention area, provide 300k houses with fibre infrastructure by way of a commercial operation, and reduce the size of the intervention area accordingly.
I'm merely saying your interpretation, as valued and as professional as it is, and I respect it.
Yeah, but we're not.
It's not agreed by all and sundry.
There is no contest around state aid rules. That is the way they apply. The state aid rules and the contract law that apply in relation to the National Broadband Plan intervention area are clearly set out and were read out by Fergal earlier in the process. They are black and white. They are not contestable.
I don't know.
The correspondence we got from the CEO of AIR, there was a meeting on the 23rd of January, attended by the former Minister Naughton, Richard Moult, who was CEO of AIR at the time. I was in attendance, Kieran and one or two other colleagues. We made it clear at that meeting with the CEO that we had done a lot of work on addressing the red line issues that AIR had set out. He indicated to us his intention to withdraw from the procurement process. I said to him that in every normal negotiation that I had been involved in, that often the most difficult issues to be addressed are those issues that are left to the end, and that there was a possibility that some of the other red line issues that they had identified we would be capable of moving on, and others we simply could not. Again, going back to the obligations of the state aid rules and the contract. As we have said earlier, that meeting shouldn't be seen in isolation. We had 65 meetings and 200 hours of dialogue with the company prior to that. Everything that they had ventilated in terms of concerns and that they have put in their letter that we have received in the last week were all on the table when we were in the dialogue process. We asked him to go back and to meet with his board to reconsider, because we felt it was important for them to be involved in the process. He went back to his board, reconsidered, and wrote to the Minister on the 30th or 31st of January, saying that we are withdrawing from the process. We didn't have contact with him, perhaps, other than through...
Just
was there
a
any contact? Yeah.
Just it's on that very point.
The Minister responded to the letter. At that point in time, they had withdrawn from the process. They didn't say to us at that point that we could do it for $1 million based on what we know on the 300k or anything like that, or for $1 billion. Even if they did, they were effectively saying we'll do something by way of a different process that is not mandated by state aid rules.
But you're now investigating that. You're now engaging in a process and informing the public as to why you believe that contention can't be delivered. Why is it that we had to wait till now for that to be the case, when there was ample opportunity, I would have thought, between the Minister, yourselves and whomever was privy to the information that came in the letter on the 30th of January to investigate that contention and to emphatically refute that suggestion, rather than leave it there, when I and my colleagues in the Dáil are hearing, as I said, the Taoiseach and the Minister tell us that every other alternative and consideration was checked and rechecked, so much so that you can take our word for it, that it's 3 billion. and you'll have to live with it and proceed accordingly. Because that's what I was led to believe. But then I hear about this letter, and it did mention specifically at a fraction of the cost.
But it did also.
And in the meantime, Air have invested 150 million in mobile 4G. They've given announcements about 750 jobs in the region. They've talked about, new apprenticeship programs, 2 of them, I think. Yeah. And I'm sure there was ministers and departments all over those items, and that there was great credence given to them and great help and assistance afforded to them in order for that to be delivered. And of course, we welcome that in the economy. But in the meantime, back at the bloody ranch, I'm told it's costing 3 billion when it should only cost 1 billion in my eyes and in the taxpayers' eyes. Okay. And at the same time, the National Development Plan has been ripped to shreds in relation to other projects.
Mr. Griffin in on that point.
It's okay. So what I would say to you, Deputy, is this, and you read a letter and they're crystal clear in saying this is not an offer. What they are saying is, if we could do this in a particular set of ways, which are not allowable under state aid rules.
But you see, that's
finish.
We could possibly do it at a different price.
And you didn't think, or it's not the opinion of those who have responsibility in this area, who are acting in the best interest of the public and the taxpayers, we said at the beginning, didn't think it necessary to maybe, hold on a second, let's call these boys back in. Let's put this to bed one way or the other. So as that if I'm ever faced, or you or anybody belonging to is ever faced by us that represent the taxpayer and are elected in order to ensure that they get value for money, that if that question is put to them about this letter and it having a contention within it, that this could be done at a fraction of a cost if you do it in a different way. Because Joe Public looking in says to himself, well look, what do I get at the end of the day? Do I get broadband? Yes, I get it. How do I get it? I'm not particularly worried or convinced about, but if I get it for a 2 billion less than what the others are telling me, well then I need to know what's going on here. And you're talking to me about the state aid rules. I'm just saying to you in relation to that contention that you and your colleagues made earlier, that there was differing opinion on that. And as Deputy Stanley said, maybe it would have been necessary or more convincing for me if I had a note from the Commission to confirm that.
I don't know where the differing opinion exists.
But I'm telling you, Air had a different opinion about your interpretation of what the state aid rules that governed this were. No, and it meant that they walked away from it. But I mean, we go back and check what was said earlier.
They walked away from a process that involved certain conditions deriving from state aid rules and contract law. That is what they did.
Of which they had a different interpretation or legal advice than what you were telling them your interpretation was.
The same way as they wanted it the same as a 300,000, which is a commercial, isn't that correct?
Yeah, and I mean, I was connected as part of that today for a lot less than what we've been talking about here earlier.
Under state aid rules.
The difference in interpretation on the legal advice was in relation to the contagion issue, which we have dealt with in the course of the hearing this afternoon.
Well, it doesn't take away, and I'll check that, but I don't necessarily agree that that's the case in the way in which it was delivered here this evening. But I mean, the point I'm making to you is that this letter was sitting on someone's desk. Whose desk was it sitting on? What communication, if it was sent to the Minister, did the Minister contact the officials? Because as I said to you, the result of this, as a colleague of yours in another department said, this has a knock-on effect for other capital development projects in the state that many people were led to believe would take place in the forthcoming years, and we're not sure if they can now, let alone the threat that's there by Brexit. But there's 2 billion has to be found, and where it's to be found from, I'm not yet told exactly where it's coming from.
The letter we got from Air, from the CEO, was to say we're withdrawing from a process because the obligations being placed on us are too onerous and too complex. That was after 65 meetings and 200 hours of discussion where we moved on 83 of their 100-plus red lines.
Fine.
So we listened to them very closely on every single thing that they had raised.
As I'd expect, and I appreciate you did.
Absolutely. So there was nothing new in the letter. The fact that they could say they could do it for a reduced price,
fraction of the cost,
was based on things that could not be allowed under state aid rules.
Well, why not tell them that then? Why not have it on the record so as it could be presented to us to say, yeah, they did make that contention, and we did not agree with it based on A, B and C, and we met them and went through them and explained that. Because the record will show there was no response. The record doesn't tell me, or nobody has told me, who did the Minister contact after receiving that letter and what discussion was had. I put an FOI in it and I got very little back.
The record will show that the 200 dialogue meetings or the 200 hours of dialogue meeting with heirs covered all of these issues.
Well, why didn't you put it? Why wasn't it responded to make that point then? Why have I to depend on your word now that that was the case?
Well, sorry, the Minister did respond. The Minister did respond.
And did the...
Just let him say what the response, if you have it there.
He said that we recognise your personal commission to the NBP procurement process, and I believe we published these letters, and if not, we can. We did publish them. However, I also acknowledge the decision not to engage in any further procurement process is entirely a commercial matter for AIR. So that is fundamentally it.
So there was no... So he didn't... in that correspondence, he never referenced the point that was made that if you step outside the way in which you want the state to do it and do it a different way, that it could be delivered at a fraction of the cost. And there was nothing in writing to refute that.
But Deputy, the rules by which the state carry out this process are mandated by state aid rules.
That may well be the case.
We do not dream them up.
That may well be the case. But I think it was incumbent on whomever had responsibility to categorically state that in response rather than leave that hang, because it was left to hang, and it has been, added to now by virtue of a figure being put on it, not in addition to the fact that the 300,000 are now more or less complete, and there's a lot more information and knowledge about how it can be delivered, and that comes into play too. But I mean, there's a lot of people very alarmed, and it's because of that alarm that people wanted these hearings to get to the root of this. And within us doing that, I see and I hear that the letter came from AIR in 2017, or 2018, further to a meeting that only took place a couple of days earlier that you alluded to, and correctly and rightly so. But that the response from the Minister was not adequate to refute the suggestion and the contention that was in the letter in relation to it being done at a fraction of a cost. You needed to say at that time, we're not backing down for anybody, we're proceeding, we're carrying on, we're sticking to the process that we have put there, irrespective of the fact we might only have one left, irrespective of the fact that we still think we can deliver within 7 or 8 years. And now, of course, we're at a juncture whereby we say, well, if we sit down again, there'll be another 3 years procurement and all this sort of thing. That baffles people. What people understand is, and what they can't get their heads around, and what I'm trying to get my head around, is that there's one entity with vast experience and expertise and much of the infrastructure in place that say they'll give us something for $1 billion, and there's somebody else whom I know nothing about, who we're putting 200 million up and exposing the state to 2.9, and they're saying they can do the same thing at a cost of $3 billion to us. So it's very hard to square that circle.
Well, I go back to
and especially when representatives of the government tell us that every road was travelled down in order to be sure that every possible way in which this could be done was investigated before they arrived at the conclusion.
Every road was travelled, and when you say $1 billion versus $3 billion, again you're comparing apples and oranges. They have a mid-case scenario of $1.55 billion against our mid-case scenario of $2.1 billion.
Okay, and what's the outward? What's the lower one?
And they are saying that they will deliver that if a particular set of rules are applied. The rules that we have, and which they signed up to in 2015, following public consultation with them and all the bidders, are rules that are mandated by state aid and contract law.
That are costing us $2 billion to mind the $1 billion we're investing.
You know, we could hypothetically go back out and run a competition that didn't involve us including state aid rules or contract law. We wouldn't get any state aid clearance, and we couldn't pay subsidy to whoever won that contract.
We'll have to agree to differ. And as I said, I register my disappointment that there wasn't adequate content in the Minister's letter to assure me or anybody belonging to me or whom I represent that thorough investigation was taking place to respond to it in the way in which it should have been. Secondly, by conferring preferred bidder status to GMC, in the event of you not entering into a contract with them, is there a cost due to the state?
Under the contract, no.
There isn't.
No.
So preferred bidder status doesn't mean anything legally, or there's no...
Well, I wouldn't say it doesn't mean anything legally.
What does it mean?
I can't predict what a bidder might do in the courts if we step back for some reason for conferring preferred bidder process. But there's no contractual obligation to pay over for work done.
Is there a contractual obligation to complete a contract?
Only when the contract is signed.
Is there a contractual obligation to complete a contract on foot of conferring preferred bidder status?
No. So we're working through the final set of due diligence around finances and other things. That will involve us moving to a point around contract close, and then there are contractual commitments when we go into contract close.
So you can definitively say that if the state withdrew from the process in favour of a new tendering process to take advantage of Air's proposal, we'll say, the state would not be liable in any way, shape or form to Granhan McCourt.
That's not what has been said. To be absolutely clear, what we've said is that the NBP procurement process and the documentation for that process calls out that there is no compensation, there is no cost compensated for bidders in the process.
For preferred bidders?
At any stage in the process, we're not liable for costs of the bidder. So we've called that out at the outset. In terms of, you asked the question, what does preferred bidder status mean? Preferred bidder status clearly means that we've reached a stage of the procurement where the government was satisfied to take the decision that a bidder who had come through the evaluation, had passed the evaluation, had demonstrated that they had met the requirements of the procurement, and an intention by the government, having conferred them as preferred bidder, to move forward to contract award, subject to the necessary steps being put in place.
So you're saying the government is obliged?
No, what I'm saying is...
The government is obliged to sign the contract.
What I'm saying is that maybe I'm not being... I'm
sorry not to be so good.
Just let him answer it.
I'll go as long as I need to go to get it as clear as I can get it, Deputy.
And so will I.
Right. The preferred bidder is... It's just important that it's understood. It is an absolute critical milestone in the procurement process where you have said, I recognise that the party before me has met the test of what it is that I have asked the market to bid on and is capable of delivering that. That's one. And secondly, it is my intention to move forward and bring this to a contract. That's the purpose of the declaration, because what you then want is for that party to engage in the whole next step of the process. And that involves them engaging in procurements, to engage subcontractors.
Just let him finish.
And to put in place a whole suite of contracts that we will need to see are there before government could sign a contract and have the confidence that the broadband plan would be delivered. So it is a very significant milestone.
Yeah, it is a very expensive one if you don't proceed, because you have categorically said now to them in conferring preferred bidder status that they have met the criteria laid down for them to deliver the project to the state.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case in terms of the norms of the procurement process like this.
So if Air's proposal was one that could be supported, what would you do?
But Air have said it's not a proposal. I mean, I don't know how many times
have you sat down to discuss it with them? But see, if you stepped out of the process, are you saying you can't step out of the process?
You can always step out of a process.
Is there a cost to the state if you do, considering you've given conferred bidder status to GMC, and you've in doing that, you've said to them, and you've given on behalf of the state, you've said to them, we now acknowledge you've met the criteria. We acknowledge you have done all we've asked. We acknowledge you have the capacity and you are going to deliver this.
Which is the factual situation, because of all the due diligence.
If you step outside of that, you won't have much luck in court.
Because of all the due diligence that we have done over the time since the receipt of tender, that is factually the case. Detailed, independent, technical, financial assessments, they have passed all the tests, and we have moved to preferred bidder status.
So it's we can't, the best will in the world, if Air was substantiated, you wouldn't be able to take them
But I
on.
keep coming back to the point, Deputy. Air have said this is not a proposal. It is not an offer. It does not
If they told you tomorrow it was,
we would say to them,
you'd walk away from it because you've gone so far you can't
Let Mr.
turn back.
Griffin answer.
But as we've discussed earlier in the process, or earlier in the debate this evening, if the government were minded for any reason to look at that, we cannot go in and talk to Air and say to you, well, here's €1 billion. You cannot do that.
I know, I agree with you.
Under law, you cannot do it.
I know.
You have to go back out to a procurement process. And they have
shooting
said,
in the dark here.
Mr. Griffin finish. Yeah.
And they have said the letter, not the offer, the letter is based on applying a set of rules that apply for the Air 300k, which we have spent the whole evening explaining why that cannot work from a state aid perspective.
I've come to the conclusion, with your indulgence, Chair, that we're shooting in the dark, that if Air could substantiate their claim and turn that into an offer, you're not in a position, or the state wouldn't be in a position, to take them up on the offer.
And just on that, can you go back into procurement
This is all great,
with
but I know where
one
it's bringing us.
particular company? Can you tailor a procurement process for one particular company like Air? I think that's an important question to ask in the context of what Deputy Cowan has just said. In an ideal world, hypothetical world, is that legal? Can you do that?
It has to be an open process. We have got legal advice on that. We got it in the context of, can we assign the function to ESB?
Yeah.
No, you can't. It has to be a procurement process. Bidders come back in, or maybe they don't, because of all the discussion around Air being such a great thing and coming forward with $1 billion and all the rest. But we simply cannot design a procurement process which says, do what you've done with 340k, apply the set of rules, which are only rules that apply by way of regulation. And we set out in our presentation this evening the differences between regulation and state aid. And we don't accept, by the way, that the $2 billion that they talk about as a difference is by virtue of a heavy regulatory burden. I mean, we don't accept that for a second. There are different things at play here.
There is no turning back, it would appear. As I said to you, if Air could substantiate their claim, if it became an offer, if it was on the table in front of you now, you wouldn't be able to sign it. I think the report to the committee will be...
But sorry,
you're
talking about substantiating a claim based on a different set of rules.
Yeah, but sure, I mean, we're only going through the motions here. And, you're doing your best to answer the questions, but if it were such that, as I said to you, if it were such that Air undoubtedly could provide this facility for $1 billion, if it was undoubted, you still couldn't take them up on the offer.
But what they have said is...
Because you've gone so far, and the preferred bidder status, I don't know whether that was your idea or a political idea.
No, it's part of the contract process. And I
Strange it came the 20th of May, or whenever it was.
Deputy, let Mr. Griffin answer, please.
The point is, you cannot go back into a process which says, we want to talk to you, and we want you to do it on the basis of the rules that are set out there, the Air 300.
Why didn't you a month ago, so we wouldn't be here at all?
That's contract law, that's state aid rules, that you can't...
Sorry, I won't call it a proposal. We didn't see the letter a month ago.
We had a letter in January 18. There wasn't a substantial response to it either.
We had a letter in January 18 which we have gone through in great detail. In the process of dialogue
prior to the letter,
leading up to their withdrawal. The letter was only a reflection of what they said to us in the dialogue process.
So much so that it didn't
Deputy Murphy, I'm going to bring you in for one question.
Yeah, it's only going to be one question because it's been a long evening.
Yeah, it has 4 hours,
here.
in fairness
so
to the department officials.
Neither am I on the committee. But, this whole scenario, really, you have to admit, has been a roller coaster. And I think the public out there have lost a lot of confidence in the whole process. I'm just going to ask you one question. Are you absolutely confident that Graham McCourt can deliver this to this nation, deliver it to the people, deliver it for the government? And secondly, what if something went wrong 6 or 9 months down the road into the contract? Would you then not have to go and reschedule the whole process and have a new
But sure, again,
a new
Deputy,
tender.
we're back into the whole area of hypotheticals in relation
Well,
to your second
hypotheticals
question.
do arise.
In relation to your second question, in relation to your first question, the answer is yes. And they have passed all the tests: financial, technical, future-proofing, commitment to the obligations of the contract which all the bidders signed into in 2015, clawback mechanisms, separate oversight mechanism, ministerial appointee, all of that. So yeah, absolutely, they've signed up to it, and they have, notwithstanding some of the comments that have been made in recent times, they have the technical capacity to do this.
Okay, thank you very much. And I know this has been a very long session, but I think it shows, I suppose, your commitment to coming before us and to answering all our questions. And I was very conscious of letting members and non-members of the committee the opportunity to come before you today to get clarity on what is a very important issue. So the Joint Committee stands adjourned until 3 p.m. on the 9th of July.